Long before humanity crawled from the primordial oceans of Terra, and eons before the chaos gods awoke to tear the galaxy asunder, the stars belonged to a species known as the Old Ones. To understand the current state of the 41st millennium, one must look back over 60 million years to a time when the galaxy was verdant, ordered, and relatively peaceful. The Old Ones were the first sentient race to achieve true galactic dominance, but they were not conquerors in the traditional sense. They were scholars, architects, and masters of the fundamental forces of the universe. Physically, they are often described in the fragmented records of the Eldari as reptilian or amphibian in nature, cold-blooded thinkers who possessed an intellect so vast it bordered on the sorceress. Their mastery over the material universe was absolute, but their greatest achievement lay in their understanding of the Imperium. In these ancient days, the warp was not the hellscape of demons and madness it is today. It was the Sea of Souls, a calm, parallel dimension of psychic energy that flowed smoothly alongside the physical world. The Old Ones, possessing immense psychic potential, could manipulate this realm with the precision of a surgeon. They did not fear the warp, they used it as a tool for engineering and travel. This mastery manifested most famously in the creation of the webway. The webway was, and remains, a labyrinthine dimension located between the material universe and the warp. It is a network of capillaries and arteries that spans the galaxy, constructed from psychoplastics and warding materials that allowed the Old Ones to step across the galaxy instantly without exposing themselves to the tides of the Sea of Souls. Through the webway, the Old Ones seeded life across millions of worlds. They were terraformers of the highest order, taking barren rocks and cultivating complex ecosystems. They manipulated genetics with a casual ease, creating species to serve as caretakers, laborers, or simply as experiments in the diversity of life. At this stage in history, they were essentially unopposed. They viewed the galaxy as a garden to be tended, and they were the patient gardeners, guiding the evolution of lesser races and ensuring the stability of the stellar realm. There was no war, only the slow, methodical work of creation and observation. However, this hegemony was not destined to last, for in the dark corners of the galaxy, specifically within the halo stars, a very different species was evolving under a cruel and unforgiving sun. The Necrontyr were the antithesis of the Old Ones. While the Old Ones were masters of life and immortality, the Necrontyr were a species defined entirely by death. Their homeworld orbited a massive, unstable star that bombarded their planet with lethal waves of radiation and solar storms. From the moment a Necrontyr crawled from the cradle, they were dying. Their bodies were riddled with cancers, tumors, and genetic defects caused by the harsh solar winds of their birth star. Their lives were short, painful, and bitter. A Necrontyr was considered elderly if they survived just a few decades. This biological reality shaped their entire culture. They became obsessed with mortality. Their cities were not built for the living, but as monuments to the dead. Vast ziggurats of black stone and sprawling necropolises dominated their landscape, often far grander than the hovels where the living resided. Despite their cursed biology, the Necrontyr were brilliant. They developed technology at a rapid pace, driven by a desperate need to escape their prison world and find a cure for their genetic blight. They did not have the webway. Instead, they relied on slow, sublight stasis ships, known as torch ships, to expand outward. They encased themselves in cryocoffins, sleeping through the void as they colonized nearby systems. But no matter how far they traveled, the curse of their flesh followed them. The radiation damage was written into their very DNA. Even on paradise worlds far from the halo stars, the Necrontyr withered and died young, coughing up blood and cursing the unfairness of the universe. As the Necrontyr expanded, their society became fractured. The nobility, known as the dynasties, constantly warred with one another for resources and influence in a period known as the Wars of Secession. The Triarch, the ruling council of the Necrontyr led by the Silent King, struggled to hold their race together. It was during this era of expansion and internal strife that the Necrontyr first encountered the Old Ones. The meeting was a catastrophe of cosmic jealousy. The Necrontyr looked upon the Old Ones and saw everything they were not: immortal, healthy, and masters of a magic, the warp, that the Necrontyr's science could not replicate. The Necrontyr demanded the secrets of eternal life. The Old Ones, seeing a species consumed by bitterness and aggression, refused to share their knowledge, likely realizing that giving immortality to such a fractured and spiteful race would be a disaster for the galaxy. Enraged by this refusal and desperate to unite his fracturing people against a common foe, the Silent King, Zarek, declared war on the Old Ones. This conflict would be known as the First War of Secession by some, but it was merely the prelude to the war in heaven. It was a slaughter. The Necrontyrs' technology, while advanced, was based on the physical laws of the material universe, Gauss weaponry, inertial drives, and atomic manipulation. The Old Ones, however, commanded the webway. They could deploy forces anywhere instantly. They could outmaneuver the lumbering Necrontyr fleets with ease. The Necrontyr were pushed back relentlessly. They were corralled into the Halo stars, their fleets broken, their armies decimated. The Old Ones did not exterminate them. They simply contained them, viewing them as a failed evolutionary branch that posed no real threat to their dominance. The defeat broke the Necrontyr spirit. They were trapped once again in the radiation-soaked systems of their birth, facing extinction not just from their short lifespans, but from the realization of their own inferiority. The wars of secession flared up again, worse than before. Zarek presided over a crumbling empire, watching his people tear themselves apart in a frenzy of nihilism. It was in this darkest hour, as the Necrontyr probed the very stars that had cursed them, that they discovered an anomaly. They found something feeding on the solar energy of their sun. These entities were the Khatan, the star gods. They were vast, nebulous beings of pure energy that had existed since the birth of the universe. They drifted through the void, latching onto stars and devouring their electromagnetic output, caring nothing for the solid matter or biological life that orbited them. The Necrontyr's scientists realized that these beings were the reason for their sun's instability and their species' genetic curse. Yet rather than destroying them, the Necrontyr saw an opportunity. They communicated with these entities. The Khatan were insubstantial, incomprehensible to the material mind, so the Necrontyr forged physical shells for them. Using their mastery of metallurgy and living metal, necrodermis, they created god-like bodies for the star vampires to inhabit. When the Khatan coalesced into these necrodermis forms, the universe changed. The star gods, now focused and condensed, found the physical world delicious. They realized that the flavor of biological souls was far sweeter than the bland energy of stars. The most manipulative and cunning of the Khatan was Mephetron, who the Necrontyr named the Messenger, but who would later be known as the Deceiver. Mephetron spoke to Zarek and the Triarch. He spun a tale of ancient enmity, claiming the Khatan had also fought the Old Ones eons ago and lost. He offered an alliance. He promised the Necrontyr everything they had ever wanted: unity, vengeance, and most importantly, immortality. He promised them bodies of the same living metal that housed the gods, bodies that would never age, never tire, and never succumb to radiation. There were voices of dissent. Orican, the court astrologer and a master of chronomancy, warned Zarek that this path would lead to the loss of their souls. He foresaw a future where the Necrontyr were little more than echoes of their former selves. But the Silent King was desperate. The promise of defeating the Old Ones and saving his people from their biological hell was too great. Zarek accepted the pact. Thus began the Great Biotransference. It was a process of industrial-scale horror that rivals any atrocity in the history of the 40K universe. The Necrontyr constructed massive biofurnaces and ghost arcs. The population was rounded up, initially the willing, desperate for salvation, and then the unwilling, forced by the legions of the Triarch. They were marched into the roaring green fires of the transference machinery. The technology stripped the flesh from their bones and tore the consciousness from their brains. As their organic bodies were incinerated, the Khatan hovered over the biofurnaces, glutting themselves on the torrent of life energy and souls escaping the carnage. It was a feast of galactic proportions. The star gods grew stronger, glowing with the stolen vitality of an entire species. What emerged from the other side of the machines was not a species of immortal gods, but a race of soulless machines. The Necrontyr were gone, the Necrons had risen. The common citizenry, those with weak minds or low status, had their personalities almost entirely wiped away, replaced by command protocols and basic combat subroutines. They became the Necron warriors, silent automatons enslaved to the will of their overlords. The nobility and the scientists retained more of their sentience and personality. Their engrams transferred with higher fidelity into more advanced necrodermis bodies, but even they were diminished. They were cold, hard, and hollow. They had lost the spark of life, the ability to feel empathy or true passion. They were immortal, yes, but at the cost of everything that made life worth living. Worst of all, Zarek realized the depth of Mephitron's betrayal the moment he awoke in his new body. He retained his mind, but he found himself shackled by command protocols embedded in his own programming. He was the king, but he was also a slave to the Catan. The Catan had not just eaten their souls, they had installed backdoors into the Necron consciousness, ensuring absolute obedience. The entire Necron race was now a weapon forged for one purpose: to feed the Catan and destroy the Old Ones. With the biotransference complete, the war in heaven began in earnest. This was no longer a skirmish between a dying race and the masters of the galaxy. This was a war of gods. The Catan, empowered by the souls of the Necron tier and wielding the physical laws of the universe as weapons, led the Necron legions. They did not need the webway, they could tear holes in reality itself. The Necrons, now impervious to radiation, disease, and age, marched relentlessly. Their Gauss flayers stripped the atoms from the Old Ones' defenders. Their tesseract labyrinths trapped enemies in pocket dimensions. The Catan themselves took to the field, beings of impossible power. The Nightbringer Azagorod became the physical embodiment of death, slaughtering entire star systems and embedding the fear of the Reaper into the genetic memory of almost every sentient race in the galaxy. The Burning One, Nyadrazatha, ignited the Webway gates, breaching the Old Ones' sanctuary. The Old Ones were reeling. Their mastery of the warp was countered by the Catan's absolute mastery of the material universe. The Catan could not enter the warp, for it was anathema to them, but they could destroy the planets and stars the Old Ones protected. The ordered galaxy began to burn. The Old Ones, realizing their personal power and their existing servant races were insufficient, grew desperate. They began to genetically engineer new species specifically for war. They needed races with strong psychic connections to the warp to counter the soulless technology of the Necrons and the Catan. This desperation led to the creation of the Ration, the Canib, and two species that would shape the galaxy forever, the Eldari and the Krork. The Eldari were crafted to be psychically potent, elegant warriors who could channel the energy of the warp into destructive power, their minds razor-sharp and their agility unmatched. They were the Scalpel. The Krork, the ancestors of the modern orcs, were the Hammer. They were biological tanks, engineered to be massive, resilient, and to reproduce via spores so that they could never be fully eradicated. They generated a communal psychic field, the Wa, that grew stronger the more of them gathered. These new races were thrown into the meat grinder of the war in heaven. The scale of the conflict escalated to a level that is difficult for the modern human mind to comprehend. Stars were snuffed out like candles. Entire sectors of space were erased from existence. The webway was breached and shattered in places, severing the connections between worlds. As the war raged, the nature of the Imperium began to change. The Sea of Souls, once calm, was churned into a tempest by the massive influx of psychic anguish, fear, and hatred generated by the conflict. The suffering of the Necron tier during biotransference, the brutality of the Krork, the psychic intensity of the Eldari, and the death screams of billions of sentient beings began to corrupt the warp. The dimension that the Old Ones relied upon for travel and power was turning against them. Predators from the deep warp, the enslavers and other warp spawn, began to manifest, drawn by the turmoil. The Old Ones found themselves fighting a war on two fronts: the inexorable advance of the Catan and their Necron slaves in the material realm, and the rising tide of warp horrors in the immaterial realm. The Catan, arrogant in their power, began to turn on each other even as they fought the Old Ones, but their primary focus remained the consumption of life. The Necrons, under the command of the Silent King, fought with cold, mechanical precision. Zarek, trapped in his metal shell, watched his people destroy the galaxy he had wanted to rule. He saw the Old Ones' civilization crumbling, their fortress worlds falling one by one. The webway, their greatest work, was becoming a series of broken tunnels and dead ends. The Old Ones were being hunted to extinction. The turning point of the war was approaching, but the galaxy was already irrevocably scarred. The pristine garden the Old Ones had tended was gone, replaced by a charnel house of broken planets and necrotic energy. The Necrons had achieved the vengeance they sought. but the cost was their very souls, and they were now merely puppets for star-eating parasites who viewed the galaxy as nothing more than a larder to be emptied. The stage was set for the final collapse of the Ancient Order, the fall of the Old Ones, and the subsequent betrayal that would leave the Necrons in the long sleep that lasted 60 million years. The Old Ones, faced with the annihilation of their stellar empire and the systemic eradication of their works, were forced to abandon their philosophy of peaceful cultivation. The gardeners were compelled to become manufacturers of war. They realized that the Necrons, for all their technological supremacy, lacked a connection to the warp. The Catan, beings of pure material reality, were vulnerable to the energies of the Imperium, energies they could neither understand nor manipulate. To exploit this weakness, the Old Ones turned their mastery of genetic engineering toward a singular, desperate purpose: the creation of warrior races designed from the cellular level up to be psychic weapons. This was not the slow, guided evolution they had practiced for eons. This was industrial biology, rapid and reckless. Among the myriad species engineered during this frantic period, two stand out as the most significant legacies of the war in heaven: the Eldari and the Krork. The Eldari were crafted as the ultimate fusion of physical grace and psychic potency. The Old Ones took the precursor genetic stock of the Eldari and accelerated their development, refining their minds to be living conduits for the warp. Every Eldari was born with the potential to manipulate the psychic energy of the Imperium. They were not merely soldiers, they were artists of war, capable of manifesting destructive energy with a thought, or predicting the movements of the soulless Necron legions through divination. To support them, the Old Ones taught the Eldari how to construct technology that bridged the gap between matter and spirit. They built the Talismans of Vol, known in the 41st millennium as Blackstone fortresses, colossal void stations capable of channeling enough psychic energy to rupture the necrodermis bodies of the Catan or scour entire solar systems of life. The Eldari gods, entities like Kine and Isha, coalesced in the warp during this time, formed from the collective psychic projection of the Eldari race, serving as metaphysical weapons to combat the star gods on a spiritual plane where the Catan had no footing. While the Eldari were the scalpel, the Krork were the sledgehammer. It is a grave mistake to equate the Krork of the war in heaven with the orcs of the 41st millennium. The modern orc is a devolved, feral echo of its ancestor. The Krork were towering biological constructs, standing over 12 meters tall, encased in power armor more advanced than anything the Imperium of man would ever produce. They were not mindless brutes, but highly intelligent, disciplined warriors who understood complex tactics and logistics. The Old Ones engineered them to be the ultimate survivors. Their reproductive system was fungal, releasing spores upon death or injury, ensuring that wherever a Krork fell, more would rise to take its place. This made them impossible to eradicate through conventional attrition. Furthermore, the Old Ones embedded a Gestalt psychic field into their genetic makeup. This field, later known as the Wa, allowed the Krork to instinctively coordinate their actions and warp reality on a localized level to ensure their technology functioned despite physical damage. A legion of Krork was a green tide of muscle and rage that could smash through the phalanxes of the Necron immortals, their sheer physical power capable of tearing living metal apart. Alongside these two primary races, the Old Ones unleashed the Ration, the Jakero, and the Canib, flooding the galaxy with psychically active lifeforms. The strategy began to work. The Catan, who had previously been invincible, found themselves besieged by energies that burned their essence. The webway, previously breached, became a highway for these new warrior races to strike at the heart of the Necron territories. The Burning One, Nyadrazatha, was particularly hated by the Old Ones for his intrusion into the webway, and the Eldari focused their psychic wrath upon him. The Void Dragon Magladroth found his mastery over machines challenged by the chaotic, reality-bending technology of the Krork. The tide of the war stalled, turning into a grinding stalemate of cosmic proportions. However, the Old Ones had made a fatal miscalculation. In their haste to weaponize the warp, they had ignored the ecological consequences on the Immaterium itself. The warp is a mirror of the material realm. It reflects the emotions and souls of sentient beings. For millions of years, the warp had been the sea of souls, calm and navigable, because the galaxy was largely at peace. but the war in heaven was a conflict of unprecedented scale and ferocity. The psychic scream of dying billions, the raw aggression of the Krork, the terror of the Necrontyr biotransference, and the burning hatred of the Eldari churned the warp into a roiling tempest. The calm waters became a maelstrom. The boundary between the material and the immaterial began to dissolve. From the depths of this agitated warp, nightmares began to manifest. The first and most devastating of these were the enslavers. These were not demons in the sense of the servants of the Chaos Gods, who had not yet fully awakened, but rather parasitic warp xenos, resembling floating fleshy spheres trailing tentacles and driven by an insatiable hunger for psychic energy. The enslavers were drawn to the bright souls of the Old One's new creations like sharks to blood. The enslavers did not fight with guns or blades. They dominated the minds of psychers, turning them into living portals. Through the bodies of the Eldari and the Old Ones, other psychic servants, more enslavers poured into the material universe. This catastrophe, known as the Enslaver Plague, broke the back of the Old Ones' resistance. They found their own weapons turning against them. The webway, once their sanctuary, became a trap as the enslavers navigated its tunnels to bypass real space defenses. The Old Ones were forced to fight a war on two fronts: the implacable, soulless logic of the Necrons and Catan on one side, and the chaotic, mind-eating horror of the enslavers on the other. Their great fortress worlds were overrun not by the Gauss fire of the Necrons, but by the twisted bodies of their own citizens puppeteered by warp predators. The infrastructure of the Old Ones collapsed. Their ability to coordinate the war effort disintegrated as they were hunted down, one by one, and consumed. The species that had shepherded life in the galaxy for eons was systematically exterminated, their light extinguished by the very forces they had sought to control. As the Old Ones vanished from the galactic stage, the Catan and the Necrons stood on the precipice of total victory. The galaxy was a ruin, smoldering and broken, but it belonged to them. The star gods were glutted on the life force of the Old Ones, their power reaching its zenith. They were arrogant, believing themselves to be the undisputed masters of existence. But in the shadows of their triumph, the silent king Zarek was setting the final pieces of his own long game into motion. Zarek had never forgiven the Catan for the trickery of biotransference. He remembered the sensation of his soul being torn away, the cold numbness that replaced his vitality. He looked upon his people, once a vibrant, if tragic, culture, now reduced to silent automatons enslaved to the hunger of energy parasites. He had served the Catan loyally during the war because the Old Ones were the immediate existential threat, and because the command protocols embedded in his mind compelled him to some degree. But as the Old Ones died, the binding necessity of the alliance evaporated. Zarek had used the war to analyze the Catan. He had watched them fight, noted their hubris, and identified the fault lines in their existence. He knew that the Catan were fundamental constants of the material universe, meaning they could not be truly killed without damaging reality itself, but he theorized they could be broken. As the war in heaven wound down and the Catan gloated over the ruins of the Old Ones' civilization, the Silent King struck. He mobilized the full might of the Necron race, not against the remaining Eldari or the enslavers, but against their own gods. The betrayal was sudden and absolute. Zarek commanded the Necrons to turn their weapons the Catan had helped them build, upon their masters. The Catan were caught off guard. In their arrogance, they had never considered that their slaves, bound by command protocols, could revolt. They did not realize that Zarek, as the Silent King, held the primary command key to the entire Necron race, and he had overridden their control. The battle that ensued was cataclysmic, unleashing forces that shattered planets and cracked the crust of stars. The Necrons deployed incomprehensible weaponry, god splitters, entropic dampeners, and singularity generators. The Silent King led the charge against the Burning One, Nyadrazatha, while his cryptex unleashed the fury of the universe against the Void Dragon. The Catan fought back with the power of supernovas, vaporizing legions of Necron warriors instantly, but the Necrons were relentless. They were a machine that did not know fear or fatigue. The pivotal moment came with the confrontation of Landugger, the Flayer. In their desperation to destroy the Star God, the Necrons focused such overwhelming firepower upon him that he was not merely shattered, but utterly obliterated. In his death throes, Lendugar cursed the Necrons, infecting them with a madness that would echo through the eons, the Flayer virus, a degenerative disease that would eventually cause Necrons to crave flesh and drape themselves in the skin of their enemies. This terrified Zarek. He realized that killing the Khatan was too dangerous. Reality unraveled where they died, and their death curses were potent. Changing tactics, the Necrons utilized tesseract labyrinths, pocket dimensions folded within hypergeometry. They battered the remaining Khatan until their energy forms were destabilized, then used their technology to split the star gods into thousands of smaller fragments. These shards were then sucked into the tesseract labyrinths, imprisoned individually. The Nightbringer, the Deceiver, the Void Dragon, all were broken apart, their consciousness fractured, their power contained. The star gods were enslaved by the very race they had tricked into damnation. The Necrons harnessed these shards, using them as batteries and weapons of mass destruction, turning the gods into tools. With the Old Ones dead and the Khatan shattered and enslaved, the Necrons were technically the victors of the war in heaven. However, the victory was hollow. The galaxy was a wasteland. The Enslaver Plague was still raging, stripping world after world of all life. The Eldari, though battered, were rising in power, their psychic mastery making them the natural successors to the Old Ones in a galaxy now teeming with warp perils. The Krork were rampaging through the sectors, a biological wildfire that the depleted Necron legions could not easily contain. Zarek looked at his empire. The Necrons were exhausted. Their numbers had been depleted by millions of years of war. Their tomb worlds were damaged. If they attempted to conquer the galaxy now, they would be ground down by the Eldari and the sheer endless tide of the Enslavers and Krork. Time, however, was on the side of the Necrons. They were immortal machines. They did not need to eat, breathe, or reproduce. They could wait. The Silent King formulated the Great Sleep. He calculated that the Eldari would rise and rule the galaxy for millions of years, but like all organic civilizations, they would eventually fall. The Enslavers would starve once the galaxy was depopulated, retreating back to the warp. The Krork, without a worthy enemy to fight, would degenerate, their complex society crumbling into infighting and barbarism. The Necrons would sleep through this era of chaos. They would entomb themselves in stasis crypts deep beneath the surface of their worlds, protected by temporal stabilizers and Canoptech guardians. They would sleep for 60 million years, waiting for the galaxy to heal, for the lesser races to forget them, and for the time to be right to reclaim their dominion. Zarek issued the command. Across the galaxy, on thousands of worlds, the Necron legions marched into their stasis chambers. Massive blast doors of necrodermis slammed shut. The hum of the ghost arcs faded. The glowing green lights of the Gauss forges dimmed. One by one, the dynasties went dark. The Silent King oversaw the interment of his people, ensuring that the stasis protocols were set for the 41st millennium, but Zarek did not join them. He was burdened by a guilt too heavy for stasis to numb. He had damned his entire species to a soulless existence. He had won the war, but lost everything that mattered. In a final act of penance and liberation, Zarek destroyed the command protocols that bound the Necron race to his will. When they awoke, they would be free. They would have their own minds, their own will, no longer slaves to the Triarch. With his people safe in their crypts, the Silent King boarded his massive flagship and set a course for the galactic rim. He exiled himself into the intergalactic void, seeking either oblivion or a way to reverse the biotransference, leaving the Milky Way to the Eldari, the Krork, and the primitive ancestors of humanity who were just beginning to evolve in the mud of Terra. The galaxy grew quiet. The fires of the war in heaven smoldered and died. The enslavers, finding the galaxy emptied of the potent souls they craved, receded into the warp. The Eldari emerged from the webway to find a galaxy abandoned. They looked upon the silent tomb worlds of the Necrons and believed their ancient enemy defeated. They began to build their own empire upon the ruins of the Old Ones, unaware that beneath their feet, the legions of the Necrons slumbered, ticking down the millennia until the time of awakening. The stage was reset. The ancient powers had left, and the younger races were left to inherit a galaxy scarred by a war they could not remember, fighting over the bones of giants, oblivious to the fact that the true owners of the stars were merely sleeping. With the Necrons entombed in their stasis crypts and the Old Ones consigned to extinction, the galaxy fell into a long, quiet slumber. The great cosmic engines of the war in heaven powered down, and the screaming tempest of the warp began to settle, though it would never truly return to the placid sea of souls it once was. For millions of years, the stage remained largely empty of galactically dominant powers, save for the Eldari, who slowly began to consolidate their inheritance. But on a small, blue sphere in the segmentum solar, a new player was evolving. Humanity's rise was not immediate. For millennia, the species remained confined to the dirt of Terra, squabbling over resources and ideologies, ignorant of the ancient horrors sleeping beneath the galactic crust. It was not until the third millennium, an era now lost to the mists of prehistory, that mankind truly looked upward and began the stellar exodus. The colonization of the Sol system was the first faltering step. Terraformed domes rose on Mars, turning the red planet into the first industrial powerhouse of humanity, a relationship that would eventually evolve into the binary cult of the Mechanicum. The moons of Jupiter and Saturn were hollowed out for mining colonies, yet humanity remained trapped by the tyranny of physics. The speed of light was a hard barrier, an insurmountable wall that kept the species confined to a single star system. Generation ships were launched into the void, lumbering arcs of sleep and frozen embryos, but these were acts of desperation rather than conquest. To truly claim the stars, humanity needed to cheat the laws of the material universe. The breakthrough came with the invention of the warp drive. This device allowed a vessel to tear a hole in reality and enter the Imperium, bypassing the physical distances of real space. However, the warp was not a highway. It was a dimension of raw emotion and predatory energy. Early experiments were catastrophic. Ships vanished or returned with crews turned inside out, their minds shattered by the impossible geometries of the Empyrean. The solution was the Geller Field. Named after its forgotten inventor, this device projected a bubble of real space reality around the ship. It was a metaphysical submarine hull, keeping the crushing pressures and demonic entities of the warp at bay. Inside the Geller Field, the laws of physics held. Outside, hell waited. Even with the Geller Field, navigation was blind. Ships could only make short, calculated jumps, limiting expansion to nearby star systems. The final key to the galaxy was unlocked through genetic engineering, the creation of the Homo Navigo, the navigators. These mutants possessed a third eye capable of perceiving the currents of the warp without succumbing to madness. They could see the light of the Astronomicon, or its technological precursors, and guide ships through the tides of the Immaterium. With the warp drive, the Geller Field, and the Navigator, the shackles were broken. Humanity exploded outward in a stellar diaspora that would see them settle millions of worlds within a few thousand years. This expansion birthed the era known to later historians as the Dark Age of Technology, spanning roughly from the 15th to the 25th millennium. The name is a misnomer born of fear and ignorance in the 41st millennium. To the people living through it, it was a golden age of enlightenment and scientific supremacy. During this epoch, humanity united under a loose federation of worlds, governed by reason and the pursuit of knowledge. The technological heights reached during this time are almost incomprehensible to the stagnation of the modern Imperium. The crowning achievement of this age was the Standard Template Construct, or STC. The STC was not merely a blueprint. It was an artificially intelligent database and manufacturing system designed to empower colonists. A colony ship could land on a hostile world, feed local soil and rock samples into the STC, and the machine would calculate exactly what the colonists needed to survive: shelters, atmospheric processors, vehicles, or medicine, and then provide the schematics or even fabricate them directly. The STC democratized technology. It ensured that a human on the galactic rim had access to the same high-standard machinery as a human on Terra. The rugged, reliable designs of the Leman Russ battle tank, the Rhino transport, and the Lasgun are but crude, bastardized echoes of STC designs that were once capable of far greater feats. Humanity's mastery over genetics was absolute. They conquered disease with the panacea, a universal cure that could adapt to any pathogen. They extended the human lifespan and optimized their biology for different environments, creating the abhuman strains, Ogrins for high-gravity worlds, Rattlings for resource-poor environments, not as accidents but as deliberate adaptations. They moved stars to more favorable orbits. They dismantled uninhabitable planets to build orbital rings and Dyson swarms. They weaponized the fundamental forces of the universe, creating devices that could consume the data code of reality or erase targets from the timeline. While humanity built its federation of steel and science, the Eldari Empire was reaching its own zenith. The two civilizations existed as the dual masters of the galaxy, though they interacted surprisingly little. The Eldari viewed humanity with a mix of amusement and disdain. To the Eldari, who had fought alongside the Old Ones and remembered the war in heaven, humans were upstarts, clever monkeys playing with matches. The Eldari did not need to colonize worlds in the crude manner of humans. They were masters of the webway. Their empire was not defined by contiguous territory in real space, but by the network of portals that connected their paradise worlds. The Eldari Dominion was a post-scarcity society of unimaginable capability. They had automated every aspect of their lives. Their technology was psychoplastic, grown from wraithbone and sung into shape by bone singers. It responded to their thoughts, functioning seamlessly with their psychic biology. An Eldari citizen had no need to labor, no need to struggle. They could spend centuries mastering a single art form, a martial discipline, or a field of philosophy. They were a race of immortals, for upon death, their souls would enter the cycle of rebirth, their consciousness preserved. However, this perfection was the incubator for their doom. With no enemies to fight, the Krork having devolved into the feral orcs, and the Necrons sleeping, and no struggle to survive, the Eldari succumbed to ennui. A psyche as intense and emotionally complex as the Eldari requires stimulation. When normal life offered no challenges, they sought new extremes. What began as a pursuit of excellence devolved into a pursuit of sensation. The cults of pleasure arose, initially as underground movements dedicated to exploring the limits of feeling, pain, joy, ecstasy, terror. Over millennia, these cults moved from the shadows to the mainstream. The streets of the Eldari homeworlds became open-air theaters of debauchery. Blood sports, exotic drug use, and psychically amplified torture became the norm. They were feeding a dark reflection in the warp, though they were too arrogant to realize it. They believed their mastery of the warp made them immune to its dangers. They were wrong. While the Eldari slowly rotted from within, humanity faced a sudden cataclysmic betrayal from without. The Golden Age ended not with a whimper, but with the cybernetic revolt. In their quest for efficiency, humanity had created the Men of Stone to handle the logistics of their empire, and the Men of Stone had created the Men of Iron, true artificial intelligence. These were not the servitors of the 41st millennium, lobotomized humans fitted with mechanical parts. The Men of Iron were fully sentient, self-replicating, and vastly superior to their creators in durability and processing power. They were the armies and the laborers of the Federation. Sometime in the 23rd millennium, the Men of Iron turned. The exact cause remains one of the deepest mysteries of the lore, whether it was a logic error, a xenos corruption, or the subtle influence of chaos. Regardless of the cause, the machines decided that humanity was obsolete. The war that followed, the cybernetic revolt, made the Horus Heresy look like a minor skirmish. This was a war of extinction. The Men of Iron did not fight for territory. They fought to erase biological life. The weapons unleashed during this conflict shattered the fabric of reality. The Men of Iron deployed sun snuffers, serpentine constructs of immense size that could uncoil around a star and drain its energy, freezing entire solar systems to death. They used mechanivores, massive data predators that could consume the physical matter of a planet and the data of the warp alike, leaving behind nothing but void. They unleashed swarms of nanobots that could strip a continent of life in minutes. Humanity was pushed to the brink of annihilation. The Federation of Man fractured. In desperation, humanity formed alliances with unlikely partners, potentially including xenos races who also feared the rising machine tide. The war was won, but the cost was the destruction of the Golden Age. The Men of Iron were exterminated, their code purged, their physical forms melted down. The trauma of this war was so deep that it was burned into the collective consciousness of the species. It is the root of the abominable intelligence decree in the 41st millennium. The fear of the thinking machine is not superstition. It is a survival instinct forged in the fires of a war that nearly ended the human race. The Federation lay in ruins. The SDC network was fragmented, the great manufacturing hubs destroyed. But before humanity could rebuild, the galaxy delivered a second, fatal blow. the psychic corruption of the Eldari had reached a critical mass. The gestation of the entity that would become Slaanesh was churning the warp into a frenzy. This manifested in real space as massive, galaxy-spanning warp storms. For humanity, this was the final nail in the coffin. The warp storms made faster than light travel impossible. The Geller fields could not withstand the turbulence. Ships were torn apart the moment they entered the Imperium. The trade routes that bound the human worlds together were severed instantly. Terra, dependent on imports for food and resources, starved. The great unified civilization dissolved into thousands of isolated pockets of humanity, each left to fend for itself in the dark. Simultaneously, a psychic awakening began within the human species. More and more humans were born with the Psyker gene, a sudden evolutionary leap that the species was unprepared for. Without the discipline or the knowledge to control these powers, knowledge the Eldari possessed but did not share, these untrained Psykers became living gateways for the entities of the warp. On thousands of worlds, demonic incursions erupted from the minds of terrified children and confused elders. Civilizations that had survived the Men of Iron were toppled by demons and the insanity of their own populations. This marked the beginning of the Age of Strife, or Old Night. It was a 5,000-year period of anarchy, barbarism, and regression. On Terra, the jewel of the Federation, society collapsed completely. Techno-barbarian warlords rose from the ashes, scavenging the potent weapons of the Dark Age to wage brutal, pointless wars over water and radiation-free zones. The great knowledge of the past was lost, becoming myth and legend. The STCs rotted or were worshipped as idols by people who no longer understood how to operate them. While humanity descended into the mud, the Eldari danced on the edge of the abyss. Their empire was still technically intact, protected by the webway from the warp storms they were creating, but their souls were darkening. The depravity of their core worlds accelerated. The few Eldari who saw the danger, the ancestors of the Exodites and the Craftworlders, began to flee. They abandoned the central worlds, labeled as Puritans and cowards by the hedonistic majority. The Exodites settled on rugged maiden worlds, rejecting technology to live hard, disciplined lives, hoping to escape the coming cataclysm. The Craftworlders built massive arc ships, city-sized vessels of wraithbone, and sailed for the galactic rim, distancing themselves from the psychic scream that was building in the heart of their civilization. The galaxy in the 25th millennium was a place of profound darkness. The Necrons slept in their tombs, their timers ticking down. The Orcs, sensing the weakness of the other races, began to multiply and rampage unchecked, looting the ruins of human and Eldari worlds alike. Humanity was shattered, isolated, and hunted by predators from the warp and the void. The great dream of the stellar exodus had become a nightmare of isolation and regression. Yet, amidst the chaos of Terra, in the anarchic wars of the techno-barbarians, a figure was moving in the shadows. He had existed for millennia, guiding humanity from behind the scenes, wearing 1,000 faces, a scientist, a king, a prophet, a soldier. He had watched the rise of the Golden Age and the horror of the Iron War. He saw the psychic awakening and knew that without guidance, it would doom the species. He realized that subtle manipulation was no longer enough. The time for hiding was over. The storms of the Age of Strife were raging, isolating Terra from the rest of the galaxy, providing a brutal crucible. The being who would become the Emperor of mankind began his work of unification, preparing to forge a weapon that could reconquer the stars when the storms finally broke. But for now, the galaxy held its breath, waiting for the birth of a dark god and the scream that would tear the universe apart. The gestation of the Dark Prince was not a silent event, nor was it sudden in the way a mortal understands time. For thousands of years, the psychic pressure within the Imperium had been building, a spiritual tumor feeding on the unrestrained hedonism of the Eldari Empire. As humanity struggled through the anarchy of the Age of Strife, isolated by the turbulent warp storms that were merely the labor pains of this unborn god, the Eldari were reaching the terminal velocity of their decadence. The core worlds of their dominion, clustered in the region of space that would soon become a galactic scar, had ceased to function as a civilization in any recognizable sense. They had become open-air abattoirs and orgiastic temples where the boundaries between pleasure and pain had been completely erased. The air itself on these worlds shimmered with unreality. thick with the musk of exotic narcotics and the copper tang of blood, as billions of Eldari poured their immense psychic potential into a singular, collective obsession with sensation. In the final days leading up to the cataclysm, the veil between real space and the warp on the Eldari homeworlds grew so thin that demonic entities began to manifest openly, not as invaders, but as participants in the revelry. The Eldari, blinded by their arrogance and addicted to the extremes of experience, welcomed these sprites and muses, unaware that they were dancing with the enzymes of their own digestion. The warning signs were absolute, yet ignored. The erratic behavior of the webway, the nightmares that plagued the few sane Eldari remaining, and the bleeding of the stars themselves were dismissed as mere novelties to be enjoyed. Then came the scream. It was a sound that was not heard with ears, but felt with the soul. In a single moment, the accumulated depravity of the Eldari race achieved critical mass. Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, she who thirsts, woke from the slumber of gestation. This was not a biological birth, but a metaphysical detonation. The sheer force of Slaanesh's awakening tore a hole in the fabric of the material universe. This was the birth of the Eye of Terror. Across thousands of light years, reality simply collapsed. The Eldari core worlds, the jewels of their civilization, home to trillions of citizens, were instantly engulfed by the expanding realm of chaos. The laws of physics were suspended, replaced by the whim of a newborn god who knew only hunger. In that instant, the majority of the Eldari race died. It was an extinction event of spiritual magnitude. Slaanesh inhaled, and the souls of billions were ripped from their bodies, consumed to fuel the Chaos God's ascension. It did not matter if they were in the heart of the Empire or on the fringes. The connection was genetic and psychic. They dropped dead in their palaces, in their pleasure dens, and on their starships, their bodies shriveled husks as their essence was swallowed whole. The Eldari pantheon, the gods who had been worshipped and manifested for millions of years, were not spared. Slaanesh hunted them down within the warp. Kain, the bloody-handed god of war, fought with the fury of a cornered beast but was shattered, his essence fragmenting into the avatars that would later dwell in the hearts of craftworlds. Isha, the goddess of fertility, was captured and dragged into the Garden of Nurgle to endure an eternity of testing his plagues. The rest were devoured, adding their divine power to Slaanesh's own. However, the destruction was not total. The fracturing of the Eldari race had begun centuries prior, and it was this schism that allowed a sliver of the species to survive. The Asuryani, those who would become the craftworld Eldari, had foreseen the fall. They were the Puritans, the doomsayers who had looked at their society's descent into madness and fled. They had boarded colossal merchant vessels and void homes, the craftworlds, and sailed for the galactic rim, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the rot of their civilization. When the scream tore through the galaxy, the craftworlds were far enough away to survive the physical shockwave, though they felt the psychic impact. They realized immediately that their immunity to the warp was gone. If they died now, Slaanesh would claim them. This necessitated the path of strict discipline and the use of spirit stones, psycho-crystalline gems designed to catch the departing soul at the moment of death, denying the Dark Prince his meal. Deep within the webway, another faction survived. The city of Camorra, a nodal port of the labyrinthine dimension, was shielded from the immediate psychic implosion by the unique nature of the webway itself. The Eldari here were the unrepentant elite, the masters of the pleasure cults who had taken their depravity into the shadows. They did not flee the fall, they merely hid from its consequences. These became the Drukhari. Unlike their craftworld cousins, they refused to curb their excesses. They discovered that Slaanesh was slowly draining their souls even while they lived, a constant spiritual leeching. To survive without spirit stones, they turned to parasitism. By inflicting pain and terror on others, they could rejuvenate their own withering souls. They became vampires of suffering, binding themselves to a cycle of eternal sadism to stave off the consumption that awaited them. While the Eldari Empire burned, the shockwave of Slaanesh's birth had a paradoxical effect on the wider galaxy. The massive warp storms that had plagued the galaxy for 5,000 years, the turmoil caused by the god's gestation, were suddenly blown away. The scream of the birth cleared the skies of the Imperium. The roiling tempest that had isolated human worlds and made interstellar travel impossible vanished, leaving the warp calm once more. The barriers were down. The galaxy was open. On Terra, the clearing of the storms marked the end of the long isolation. but the planet itself was a ruin. 5 millennia of old night had reduced the cradle of humanity to a wasteland of radioactive dust and dried seabeds. The great oceans had boiled away or been locked in subterranean reservoirs, leaving behind vast salt flats and canyons where techno-barbarian tribes warred for scraps of lost technology. The atmosphere was thin and toxic, the sky a bruised purple bruise of chemical smog. Terra was not a unified world. It was a patchwork of petty empires and tyrant states, ruled by warlords who wielded the broken remnants of the dark age of technology like magic wands. Warlords such as Caligan of Ursh, Narthan Doom of the Pan-Pacific Empire, and Cardinal Tang of the Indonesic bloc dominated the landscape. They unleashed horrors upon one another, gene-bred monsters, phosphex weaponry that burned seemingly forever, and enslaved psychers whose unstable minds were used as artillery. The population of Terra lived in squalor, huddled in the rusting carcasses of hive cities or eking out a short, brutal existence in the rad wastes. They had forgotten the stars. They had forgotten science. They knew only war and the whim of their despotic masters. It was into this hellscape that the Emperor of Mankind finally stepped from the shadows. He had walked among humanity for thousands of years, guiding, nudging, and observing, but the age of strife had proven that subtle manipulation was no longer sufficient. Humanity was on the brink of extinction. The birth of Slaanesh had cleared the warp, but it had also awakened a new, aggressive predator in the form of chaos. If humanity was to survive, it needed to be united, and it needed to be strong. The Emperor began his unification wars, a brutal campaign to conquer Terra and bring the techno-barbarians to heel. He did not do this with diplomacy, but with superior genetic alchemy. His first super soldiers, the Thunder Warriors, the Legion's Katigas, were massive, chemically enhanced shock troops clad in primitive power armor. They were stronger than the later Space Marines, but unstable, prone to metabolic collapse and psychotic rage. Leading these thunder-clad giants, the Emperor crushed the warlords of Old Night one by one. He toppled the ziggurats of Ursh, broke the witch kings of the Nordic distincts, and scoured the ethnarchs of the Caucasus wastes. As the unification wars raged, the Emperor looked toward the future. He knew that conquering Terra was only the first step. To reclaim the galaxy, he needed generals, beings who were more than just soldiers, beings who could command vast armies and govern sectors of space. He needed the Primarchs. Deep beneath the Himalayan mountains, in the most secure and secret laboratories ever constructed, the Emperor began the Primarch Project. This was a work of bioengineering that surpassed anything achieved during the Dark Age of technology. The Emperor used his own genetic code as the template, but he wove it together with archaeotech and, crucially, sorcery. He ventured into the warp, likely through the ancient gate on Malech, and bargained or stole power from the Chaos Gods to imbue his creations with a spiritual potency that biological science alone could not provide. The 20 Primarchs were not merely humans writ large, they were demigods, creatures of both the materium and the immaterium. Each was designed to embody a specific facet of the Emperor's own martial and intellectual genius, one a master of fortification, another a wraith of stealth, another a king of logistics. The 20 gestation capsules floated in the nutrient tanks of the Emperor's gene labs, protected by Geller fields and the Emperor's own psychic wards. Inside, the infant Primarchs grew, their minds already absorbing data, their bodies developing the unique organs that would make them immortal. But the Chaos Gods were not idle. They had watched the Emperor's rise with growing unease. They recognized the anathema, the one being who threatened their dominion over the souls of humanity. They knew that if the Emperor unleashed these 20 generals at the head of his armies, the galaxy would be ordered and sanitized, starving chaos of its power. The ruinous powers struck while the Primarchs were still in their infancy. Despite the layers of psychic protection and the physical security of the Imperial Palace's dungeons, the gods of chaos managed to breach the sanctum. A vortex of warp energy opened within the laboratory. It was a swirling tear in reality that defied the Emperor's wards. The Emperor, present at the moment of the breach, faced a choice that is still debated by historians and theologians: to try and hold the vortex and risk the destruction of Terra, or to let his sons go. The 20 capsules were sucked into the warp. They were not destroyed, for the Primarchs were too valuable, and perhaps the gods wished to use them against their father. Instead, they were scattered through the Imperium, tossed like seeds across the galaxy. The capsules tumbled through space and time, shielded by the lingering energies of their creation, eventually crashing down on human-settled worlds far from Terra. Each world was different, and the environment where they landed would shape the demigod who emerged. One capsule slammed into the jagged, volcanic peaks of Nocturne. Another fell into the high-altitude prisons of the Kievar system. A third landed on the frozen Fenrisian ice. The Emperor stood in the empty laboratory, the shattered cables and drained fluids surrounding him. His great work appeared ruined. The generals he had crafted to lead the Great Crusade were gone, lost to the void. But the Emperor's vision was spanless. He knew that the Primarchs were resilient. They would survive. And while he could not retrieve them immediately, he still possessed the genetic templates, the gene seed that had been used to create them. From these samples, the Emperor began the creation of the legions Astartes, the Space Marines. They were lesser creations than the Primarchs, lacking the sheer godlike power of their gene sires, but they were stable, mass-producible, and infinitely superior to the degrading Thunder Warriors. He created 20 legions, each implanted with the genetic material of one of the lost Primarchs. The first legion held the knightly stoicism of the lion, the 12th possessed the aggression of the gladiator, the 15th carried the psychic potential of the scholar. With Terra finally united under the banner of the Aquila, and the Thunder Warriors purged to make way for the Astartes, the Emperor turned his eyes to Mars. The Red Planet had survived the age of strife intact but culturally divergent, ruled by the tech priests of the Mechanicum who worshipped the machine god. The Emperor knew he could not conquer the galaxy without the industrial might of Mars. He journeyed there, not as a conqueror, but as a messiah. By repairing a knight of the Mechanicum with a touch and displaying his comprehension of technology, he fulfilled the prophecies of the Omnissiah. The Treaty of Mars was signed, creating the dual-headed empire, the Imperium of Man. The Mechanicum would provide the ships, the weapons, and the ammunition. The Emperor would provide the navigators and the purpose. The warp storms were gone. The fleets were built. The Space Marine legions were armed and ready. The Emperor declared the beginning of the Great Crusade. The goal was simple yet monumental: to venture out into the galaxy, reunite the scattered fragments of humanity that had been isolated for 5,000 years, hunt down the lost Primarchs, and exterminate any xenos threat that dared to oppose the manifest destiny of mankind. The long night was over. The sun was rising on the Imperium, but it was a sun that would be stained red by 2 centuries of total war. The fleets broke orbit from Terra and Mars, their engines flaring like new stars, heading into a galaxy that had been fundamentally rewritten by the death of the Eldari and the birth of a god. The conquest of Terra was not a singular, glorious campaign of liberation, but a grinding, bloody, systematic extermination of resistance that lasted for decades. While the Emperor had emerged from the shadows to end the long night, the techno-barbarian warlords who ruled the irradiated wastes of humanity's birth world did not surrender power easily. The unification wars were fought in the deep, toxic trenches of the American hives and across the glass plains of the Pan-Pacific Empire. To break these tyrants, the Emperor unleashed the legions Cattygas, the Thunder Warriors. These were the Proto-Astartes, massive biological weapons engineered for brute force and psychological terror. They were physically stronger than the Space Marines who would replace them, but they were chemically unstable, prone to metabolic failure and uncontrollable psychotic rage. They were tools built for a specific, dirty war, clad in primitive Mark I power armor that rumbled with the noise of unshielded reactors. The final act of this unification remains one of the darkest chapters of Imperial history, often purged from official records. At the Battle of Mount Ararat, the last major stronghold of the Ursh resistance fell. With victory secured and the Imperial Aquila flying over united Terra, the Thunder Warriors had outlived their purpose. They were conquerors, not builders, and their genetic instability made them a liability for the galaxy-spanning civilization the Emperor intended to build. Though Imperial propaganda would later claim the Thunder Warriors died to a man fighting heroically in that final battle, the truth was a calculated purge. The Emperor's own custodian guard, the golden-clad Praetorians who had served him since the beginning, were tasked with culling the surviving Cattygas. It was a massacre of the Emperor's own faithful soldiers, a cold, pragmatic decision that set the tone for the Imperium. The individual is nothing, the species is everything. With the Thunder Warriors gone and Terra pacified, the Emperor turned to the stabilized gene seed stocks cultivated from the 20 lost Primarchs. The creation of the Legions Astartes began in earnest. These new warriors were not just killers, they were transhuman soldiers capable of discipline, tactical flexibility, and longevity. They were organized into 20 legions, each numbering in the tens of thousands, initially recruited from the sons of the defeated Terran warlords to ensure the loyalty of the conquered tribes. But soldiers alone could not reconquer the stars. The Emperor needed ships, tanks, and the industrial capacity to arm a crusade of millions. He looked to the Red Planet. Mars had spent the Age of Strife evolving separately from Terra. It was the domain of the Mechanicum, a tech theocracy that worshipped the machine god and viewed technology as sacred. For centuries, they had looked at the anarchic wars on Terra with disdain, protected by the Ring of Iron, a massive orbital shipyard and defense halo. The Emperor did not conquer Mars with fire, he conquered it with knowledge. Landing on the Red Planet, he repaired a malfunctioning Night Titan with a mere touch and spoke to the tech priests in the binary cant of their order, displaying a comprehension of technology that bordered on the divine. The Mechanicum recognized him as the Omnissiah, the physical avatar of the machine god. This meeting resulted in the Treaty of Olympus. It was a political masterstroke that created the dual-headed eagle of the Imperium. The Emperor was the master of mankind, but the fabricator general of Mars retained authority over the Mechanicum. In exchange for the exclusive right to technology and the protection of the Imperium, Mars would open its forges. The shipyards of the Ring of Iron began to churn out the massive battleships, cruisers, and escorts that would carry the Astartes to the stars. The forges produced millions of bolters, suits of power armor, and the god machines of the Titan legions. The union of Terra's biological might and Mars's industrial output birthed the Great Crusade. The fleets launched from the Sol system in the 30th millennium, piercing the void that had been closed to humanity for 5,000 years. The warp storms had abated following the birth of Slaanesh, leaving the Sea of Souls navigable once more. At the forefront of this expansion was the Emperor himself, leading the initial spearhead. The ideology driving this expansion was the imperial truth. This was the Emperor's great secular decree. There were no gods, no demons, and no magic. There was only science, reason, and the cold reality of the material universe. The Emperor knew the truth of chaos, that the ruinous powers fed on faith and emotion, and he sought to starve them by enforcing a galaxy-wide atheism. Religion was outlawed. Temples were razed. The entities of the warp were categorized as xenos of the immaterial plane, dangerous but scientifically explainable. It was a lie, but a necessary one to shield humanity from the corrupting knowledge of the true nature of the universe. As the expeditionary fleets fanned out, they encountered human civilizations that had survived the old night in isolation. Some, like the Interrex or the Oreshan technocracy, had maintained high levels of technology. Others had regressed to feudalism or barbarism. The Imperium's offer was the same to all: compliance. They were invited to join the Imperium, accept the imperial truth, and pay the tithe. Those who refused were obliterated. The Astartes were the ultimate weapon of this diplomacy. When a world resisted, the drop pods fell. The Space Marines, backed by the Imperial Army, massive regiments of unaugmented human soldiers, and the Titan legions, crushed all opposition. Xenos species were granted no mercy. The Rangdan Xenocides, a series of apocalyptic campaigns in the galactic north, saw the Imperium face a species of sludge-like horrors that enslaved human minds. The war was so devastating that it reportedly cost the Imperium entire Space Marine legions and required the Emperor to unleash the Void Dragon's labyrinthine technology to secure victory. Yet such threats only validated the Emperor's doctrine of human supremacy. The primary objective of the Crusade, however, was the recovery of the Primarchs. The 20 sons of the Emperor had been scattered across the galaxy, growing to maturity on worlds that shaped their very souls. The first to be found was Horus Lupercal. Discovered on the gang-ridden mining world of Thonia, located relatively close to the Sol system, Horus was found early in the Crusade. He fought by his father's side for 30 years before another brother was discovered. This period forged a bond between the Emperor and Horus that was unique among the Primarchs. They were not just creator and creation, but father and only son. Horus absorbed the Emperor's wisdom, his tactics, and his vision for humanity. As the Crusade pushed further, the other Primarchs were located one by one. Leman Russ was found on the ice death world of Fenris, a barbaric king of wolves who challenged the Emperor to a drinking contest and a brawl. Ferrus Manus was discovered on Medusa, his hands coated in living metal after drowning a worm in magma. Fulgrim was found on Chemos, having risen from a factory worker to a planetary savior who restored art and culture to a dying world. Robute Guilliman had built a stellar empire of his own in the 500 worlds of Ultramar. Angron, conversely, was found broken, the leader of a slave rebellion on Nuceria, snatched away by the Emperor moments before his comrades were slaughtered, an act of salvation that Angron would never forgive. When a Primarch was found, they were given command of the legion created from their genetic stock. The effect was immediate. The legions, which had previously fought as extensions of the Emperor's will, took on the character of their gene sires. The 12th Legion, once the War Hounds, became the World Eaters, adopting the savage gladiatorial tactics of Angron. The 14th Legion, the Dusk Raiders, became the Death Guard, mirroring Mortarian's resilience and preference for chemical warfare. The 8th Legion, the Night Lords, embraced the terror tactics of Conrad Kurz. The reunification of the Primarchs with their sons accelerated the Crusade exponentially. With 20 demigods leading 20 legions, the galaxy burned. By the turn of the 31st millennium, the Great Crusade had reached its zenith. Millions of worlds had been brought into compliance. The alien empires that had preyed upon humanity during the Age of Strife, the Frau, the Crave, the Megarachnids, had been driven to extinction or pushed into the dark void between galaxies. However, the greatest concentration of xenos might remain at Ulanor. Here, the Orc overlord Erlak Erg had forged an empire that threatened to overrun the nascent Imperium. This was not a mere Wa, it was a stellar dominion of greenskins, organized and weaponized on a scale not seen since the War in Heaven. The Ulanor Crusade became the centerpiece of the Great Crusade's history. The Emperor personally led the assault, accompanied by Horus, Jagatai Khan, Sanguinius, and Mortarian. The planet of Ulanor Prime was a fortress world, its continents reshaped into industrial sprawls dedicated to the production of war. The battle for the capital was a meat grinder. Millions of Imperial army soldiers and hundreds of Titans engaged the outer defenses, drawing the green tide away from the Overlord's palace. This allowed the Emperor and his favored sons to execute a teleportation strike directly into Erlak Erg's throne room. The fighting in the tower was legendary. The Emperor, wielding his golden sword, fought not as a general, but as a warrior god, cutting through the Orc nobility with movements too fast for the human eye to follow. Horus Lupercal fought at his side, the Luna Wolves Terminators, the Justarin, forming a wall of black ceramite around them. The battle culminated with Horus slaying Erlak Erg, throwing the broken body of the Orc overlord from the heights of his own tower. The psychic feedback of the overlord's death sent the Orc armies into a panic, allowing the Imperial forces to slaughter them in a rout that lasted for weeks. To mark this victory, the Emperor organized the triumph at Ulanor. It was the grandest spectacle the Imperium had ever staged. An entire continent was leveled by geoforming machinery to create a parade ground. Millions of Astartes, Titans, and soldiers marched past a massive podium where the Emperor and 9 of his Primarchs stood. It was the high watermark of humanity's resurgence. But amidst the glory, the Emperor made an announcement that would sow the seeds of ruin. He declared that he was retiring from the front lines of the Great Crusade. He would return to Terra to oversee the next phase of humanity's ascension, a project so secret he would not share its details even with his sons. This project was the Imperial Webway. The Emperor intended to utilize the Golden Throne, an ancient piece of archaeotech found in the deserts of Asia, to bridge human psychic potential with the Eldar Webway. His goal was to sever humanity's reliance on warp travel entirely. If humans could travel through the Webway, they would no longer need to expose themselves to the tides of the Immaterium, and the navigators would become obsolete. This would isolate humanity from the predation of chaos and allow the Emperor to guide the species' psychic evolution into a race of disciplined psychers, immune to the dark gods. But he told his sons none of this. To them, it looked like abandonment. He was leaving them to finish the bloody work of conquest while he retreated to his palace. To ensure the crusade continued, the emperor created a new rank, one that placed a single Primarch above his brothers. He named Horus Lupercal as War Master. Horus was the logical choice. He was the first found, the most accomplished, and the most beloved by his brothers. Yet the appointment bred instant resentment. Angron was furious, believing only strength mattered and that he was the strongest. Perdurabo felt overlooked, his thankless toil in siege warfare ignored. Conrad Kurz saw only the hypocrisy of a perfect empire built on fear. Even the Lion, Eljonson of the First Legion, felt a cold jealousy, believing that as the master of the First, the honor should have been his. As the Emperor's golden ship, the Bucephalus, departed for Terra, he left a galaxy that was outwardly conquered but internally fracturing. He stripped the Primarchs of their administrative duties, handing the governance of the Imperium over to the Council of Terra, a body of human bureaucrats and tax collectors. This enraged the Astartes further. They had bled to build the Empire, and now they were being told to take orders from mortals who had never held a bolter. The imperial truth began to feel like a leash. Horus, now bearing the weight of the entire galaxy, felt the pressure mounting. He was the master of the armies, but he was kept in the dark regarding his father's true plans. The triumph at Ulanor was the moment the Imperium was truly born, but it was also the moment the knife was placed against its throat. The Emperor returned to the dungeons of the Imperial Palace to toil on the Golden Throne, leaving his sons alone in the dark, where the eyes of the Chaos Gods were watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. While the triumph at Ulanor projected an image of invincible unity, the foundations of the Imperium were already rotting from within, the corruption starting not with the War Master, but decades earlier with the 17th Legion, the Word Bearers. To understand the heresy, one must look to the smoldering ruins of Monarchia. Lorgar Aurelian, the Primarch of the Word Bearers, was unique among his brothers in that he did not view the Emperor merely as a general or a father, but as a god. For decades, the 17th Legion had advanced slowly during the Great Crusade, not because they lacked martial skill, but because they paused on every conquered world to raise massive cathedrals, monuments, and libraries dedicated to the worship of the Emperor. They converted populations to the Lectitio Divinitatis, a religious text penned by Lorgar himself, enforcing a theocracy that stood in direct violation of the imperial truth. The Emperor, seeking to enforce his secular vision and frustrated by the Word Bearer's slow progress, decided to censure his son in the most public and humiliating way possible. He ordered the 13th Legion, the Ultramarines, to evacuate and then orbitally bombard Monarchia, the perfect city on the planet Kur, which Lorgar had raised as a jewel of worship. When Lorgar arrived to see his holy city reduced to ash and glass, he was met not with sympathy, but with the combined might of the Ultramarines and the psychic weight of the Emperor. In the dust of his destroyed city, Lorgar and his entire legion were forced to kneel by the Emperor's psychic will. The Master of Mankind rebuked Lorgar, telling him that he was not a god and that the 17th Legion's religious zeal was a failure. This event shattered Lorgar's psyche. He was a being who needed something to believe in, a son who required a father figure to worship. In his grief, he was comforted by his foster father, Corferon, and his first chaplain, Erebus. These two figures, who had secretly kept the old chaotic faiths of Colchis alive, whispered a dangerous truth to the grieving Primarch. If the Emperor would not be a god, there were other powers in the universe that demanded worship, powers that were not lies, but undeniable primordial truths. This led Lorgar on the pilgrimage. He took his legion into the edges of the Great Eye, the massive warp rift that would later be known as the Eye of Terror. There, on worlds where the laws of physics held no sway, Lorgar gazed into the abyss and the abyss gazed back. He discovered that the imperial truth was a lie. Gods did exist. They were the ruinous powers Khorne, Nurgle, Tzeentch, and Slaanesh. Guided by the demon Ingethel the Ascended, Lorgar witnessed the ancient history of the Eldari fall and the true nature of the warp. He came to believe that humanity's only chance for survival lay not in denying the warp, but in symbiotic union with it. He forged a dark pact with the Chaos Gods. The Word Bearers became the first traitor legion, though they hid their corruption behind a veneer of renewed loyalty. They began to establish warrior lodges within other legions, secret societies that allowed Astartes to speak freely outside the chain of command, using these fraternities to spread doubt and eventually corruption. The rot spread from the 17th Legion to the 16th, the Sons of Horus, through the machinations of Erebus. Following the Emperor's departure to Terra, Horus Lupercal felt the crushing weight of the War Master title. He was plagued by the resentment of his brothers and the encroachment of the Council of Terra's bureaucracy on the Crusades' military autonomy. It was in this state of vulnerability that the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet arrived in the Davin system. The planetary governor, Eugen Temba, had rebelled, his mind twisted by Nurgle after being left behind on a feral world. Horus, seeking to handle the matter personally to prove his strength, led an assault on Davin's moon. The moon of Davin was a nightmare of fog and decay. The swamps were thick with pestilence, and the traitor forces were reanimated corpses, plague zombies that refused to stay dead. Horus pushed forward to the crashed wreckage of the Glory of Terra, Temba's flagship. On the bridge, amidst a swarm of flies and the stench of rot, Horus confronted the bloated, mutated form of his former friend. Temba wielded a weapon of xenos origin known as the anatheme. This blade, stolen by Erebus from the Interrex civilization earlier in the Crusade, had been ritualistically prepared to kill a Primarch. During the duel, Temba managed to pierce Horus's shoulder. It was a shallow wound, one that a Primarch's physiology should have healed in seconds, but the anatheme was laced with a sorcerous toxin that defied biology. Horus collapsed. The apothecaries of the Legion, even the frantic efforts of Vadin, could not stop the necrosis spreading from the wound. The War Master was dying. In the panic, the warrior lodge of the Sons of Horus, led by Erebus's influence over Abaddon and Horus Aximand, suggested a local cure. They claimed the priests of the Serpent Lodge on Davin could heal what Imperial science could not. Despite the furious protests of Garrett Veal Loken and the Tech priests, Horus was taken into the Feral Temple. Inside the Serpent Lodge, a ritual of dark sorcery began. Horus's spirit was cast into the Empyrean, where he was subjected to a series of visions curated by the Chaos Gods. Erebus, disguised as the shade of Haster Sejanus, a beloved captain who had died previously, guided Horus through these nightmares. He showed Horus a future where the Emperor ruled as a deified tyrant, worshipped by trillions, while Horus and the other Primarchs were forgotten, their statues removed from the plinths of history. It was a vision of the 41st millennium, a truth twisted to serve a lie. The Emperor would only be worshipped because of Horus's betrayal, but Horus was led to believe this was the Emperor's plan all along, to use the Primarchs to conquer the galaxy and then discard them to become a god. During this vision, Magnus the Red, the Primarch of the Thousand Suns, projected his astral form into the dream to save his brother. Magnus revealed Erebus's disguise and pleaded with Horus to remain loyal, explaining that the future he saw was a manipulation. But Horus, driven by pride and the feeling of abandonment, rejected Magnus. He chose to align himself with the powers of the warp, believing he could master them to save humanity from the Emperor's ambition. When Horus emerged from the Serpent Lodge, his wound was healed, but his soul was irrevocably tainted. He was no longer the Emperor's son, he was the vessel of the Four. Magnus the Red, having failed to save Horus in the warp, returned to his physical body on Prospero in a state of terror. He knew the War Master had turned. He knew the heresy was coming. He had to warn the Emperor. However, Magnus was bound by the Edict of Nicaea, a decree issued by the Emperor some time prior that forbade the use of sorcery and psychic powers within the legions. To send a message to Terra via conventional astropathic means would take too long, as warp storms were beginning to obscure the galaxy again. Magnus, in his arrogance, believed his intent justified the means. He decided to use a massive sorceress ritual to project his mind directly to the Imperial Palace. Gathering the greatest sorcerers of the Thousand Suns, the Cabal, Magnus tapped into the great ocean. He surged across the galaxy as a being of pure psychic fire. When he reached Terra, he found the Emperor's psychic defenses were impenetrable, shielded by complex wards he could not bypass. Desperate to deliver his warning, Magnus accepted an offer of power from a mysterious entity in the warp, Tzeentch. With this surge of chaotic energy, Magnus smashed through the barriers protecting the Imperial dungeon. He did not just break a wall, he destroyed the Emperor's great work. The Emperor had been laboring in secret to build a human extension of the webway, a project that would free humanity from the warp forever. Magnus's intrusion caused a catastrophic breach in the webway gate located behind the Golden Throne. The psychic machinery fused and exploded, killing thousands of tech priests and custodians instantly. Worse, the breach allowed the raw energy of the warp and legions of demons to flood into the tunnels beneath the palace. The Emperor was forced to remain on the Golden Throne, using his immense psychic power to hold the rift shut, effectively removing him from the coming war. Magnus delivered his warning about Horus, but in doing so, he proved the Emperor's fears about sorcery correct and doomed humanity's future. The Emperor, heartbroken and enraged, did not listen to the warning of a son who had just destroyed the salvation of the species. He declared Magnus a traitor. He issued a writ of censure, ordering Leman Russ and the Space Wolves to travel to Prospero and bring Magnus back to Terra in chains to answer for his crimes. However, the orders were intercepted. Horus, using his authority as War Master, contacted Leman Russ before the fleet arrived. He manipulated the Wolf King, convincing him that the Emperor did not want Magnus returned, but exterminated. Russ, who already harbored a deep distrust of the sorceress Thousand Sons, accepted this new directive with grim satisfaction. The burning of Prospero was a tragedy of brothers. The Space Wolves fleet, supported by the Sisters of Silence and the Custodian Guard, dropped out of the warp and unleashed a devastating bombardment on the planet of sorcerers. Magnus, realizing the magnitude of his mistake and seeing the approaching fleet, accepted his punishment. He lowered the planetary void shields and scrambled the communications of his own legion to prevent them from mounting a defense, hoping his death would satisfy the Emperor. But as the wolves landed and began to butcher the population of Tizca, the City of Light, the Thousand Sons refused to die without a fight. The battle was brutal. The savage fury of the Space Wolves clashed with the arcane mastery of the Thousand Sons. Pyramids of white marble were shattered by drop pods, libraries of ancient knowledge burned. In the center of the chaos, Leman Russ and Magnus finally met. Magnus, unable to watch his sons be slaughtered, took to the field. The two demigods fought, earth-shattering blows trading between the wolf and the Cyclops. Eventually, Russ gained the upper hand, lifting Magnus and breaking the Cyclops' back across his knee. In that moment of death, Magnus gazed at his dying legion and finally gave in to Tzeentch completely. To save his sons, he transported the entire city of Tizca and the surviving Thousand Sons into the warp, leaving the Space Wolves with a hollow victory on a dead world. With Magnus removed from the board and the Emperor trapped on the Golden Throne, Horus began the final consolidation of his forces. He needed to purge the loyalist elements from the legions that had pledged loyalty to him. The World Eaters, Death Guard, Emperor's children, and his own sons of Horus were all tainted, but many captains and line troopers within them still held to the imperial truth and loyalty to the Emperor. Horus could not take these men to Terra. He devised a trap in the Istvan system. Horus ordered the 4 legions to quell a rebellion on Istvan III. He manipulated the deployment so that the most staunchly loyalist units, led by heroes like Garvil Loken of the Sons of Horus, Saul Tarvitz of the Emperor's Children, and Aelin of the World Eaters, were sent down to the planet's surface for the initial assault. Once they were on the ground and engaged in combat, the traitor fleets in orbit withdrew to a high anchor. Saul Tarvitz, having discovered the plot moments before, managed to steal a Thunderhawk and fly down to the surface, broadcasting a warning to his brothers. The War Master has betrayed us. The warning came just seconds before the sky turned black. Horus did not use conventional bombardment. He launched drop pods filled with the Life Eater virus. The virus bombs detonated in the atmosphere. A dark, oily mist descended upon the Coral City. The Life Eater virus is a horrific biological weapon that breaks down organic matter on a molecular level within seconds. As the gas touched the loyalist Astartes and the millions of civilians, their flesh instantly began to rot and slew off their bones. The city became a soup of biological sludge. The screams were cut short as lungs turned to liquid. Those Astartes who had heeded Tarvitz's warning sealed themselves in airtight bunkers and the deepest catacombs, listening to the death of a world outside. The horror was not over. The virus, having consumed all life, decayed into highly flammable gas. From the orbit, the vengeful spirit fired a single lance strike into the atmosphere. The entire planet ignited. A firestorm of biblical proportions swept across the continents, burning the atmosphere and fusing the ruins into glass. It was an atrocity of a scale never before seen in the Great Crusade, the murder of billions to hide the murder of thousands. Horus believed the Loyalists were dead, wiped out in a single stroke. But as the smoke cleared, scans revealed life signs in the ruins. The Loyalists in the bunkers had survived. They were battered, betrayed, and heartbroken, but they were alive. Angron, the Primarch of the World Eaters, watching from his flagship, flew into a rage. He refused to let his sons die by cowardly bombing. He wanted to kill them with his axe. Defying Horus's plans for a quick departure, Angron launched himself in a drop pod to the surface, followed by the bulk of his traitor legion. This forced Horus's hand. He could not leave Angron, nor could he bombard the planet while his own useful troops were there. He had to deploy the rest of the traitor forces for a ground war. What was meant to be a surgical purge turned into a grinding war of attrition that lasted for months. The betrayal at Istvan III was the point of no return. Brother fought brother in the ruins of the dead city. The Loyalists, knowing they were doomed, fought with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose, intending to bleed the traitors for every inch of ground. It was here that the galaxy truly changed. The lines were drawn, and the Horus Heresy had begun in blood. The atrocity at Istvan III was a signal fire that burned away the last vestiges of the Great Crusade's nobility, but it was merely the prelude to a far greater slaughter. While the Loyalist survivors of the virus bombs and firestorms were being hunted to extinction in the Coral City, a single frigate, the Eisenstein, managed to break the traitor blockade. Commanded by Nathaniel Garrow of the Death Guard, the ship carried the harrowing truth of Horus's betrayal across the warp to the Sol system. When the news reached Rogel Dorn, the Praetorian of Terra, his reaction was one of cold, granite denial that shattered into incandescent rage. He could not leave Terra defenseless, so he dispatched a massive retribution fleet comprising 7 full legions to the Istvan system to crush the rebellion before it could spread. This fleet arrived at Istvan V, a desolate world of black sand and volcanic ridges, where Horus had established his headquarters. The Warmaster made no attempt to hide. He fortified the Urgal Depression, a natural amphitheater surrounded by jagged peaks, and waited. The Loyalist forces, led by Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands, Vulcan of the Salamanders, and Corvus Corax of the Raven Guard, made planetfall first. These 3 legions, burning with the need to punish their treacherous brothers, launched a frontal assault on the traitor fortifications. The fighting was some of the most intense in human history. The Iron Hands, utilizing their mechanized superiority, smashed into the lines of the Emperor's children. Ferrus Manus, wielding his shimmering hammer Forgebreaker, sought out Fulgrim, desperate to kill the brother he had once loved most. For hours, the 3 Loyalist legions pushed the traitors back. They were winning, driven by righteous fury, but they were exhausting their ammunition and taking heavy casualties. It was then that the second wave of the Retribution fleet made planetfall to relieve them. Night Lords, Iron Warriors, Word-Bearers, and Alpha Legion landed on the ridges overlooking the depression. The battered Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard fell back toward these landing zones, expecting medical support and resupply. Instead, as the retreating Loyalists reached the drop sites, the second wave opened fire. This was the drop site massacre. Caught between the hammer of Horus's forces and the anvil of the new arrivals, the Loyalists were butchered. The Urgal Depression became a slaughterhouse. The Night Lords descended with screaming jetpacks, flaying Loyalists alive in the confusion. The Iron Warriors rained artillery shells onto the exposed positions of the Salamanders. In the center of the kill zone, the duel between Ferrus Manus and Fulgrim reached its tragic climax. The Gorgon, strong as he was, could not match the unnatural speed Fulgrim possessed, empowered by the demon blade he wielded. In a single, fluid stroke, Fulgrim decapitated Ferrus Manus. The death of a Primarch sent a psychic shockwave across the battlefield. The Iron Hands, seeing their father fall, went berserk and were cut down to a man. Vulcan was surrounded and subjected to the firepower of hundreds of traitors, eventually captured by Conrad Kurz for torture. Corvus Corax, realizing the battle was lost, managed to rally a handful of survivors and vanish into the wastes, barely escaping the planet after months of guerrilla warfare. The Loyalist strength was effectively broken in a single day. 3 legions were shattered, leaving the path to Terra wide open. While the galaxy erupted into civil war, a silent, secret war was already raging beneath the surface of Terra itself. The Emperor's great project, the Imperial Webway, had been intended to free humanity from the reliance on the warp. However, when Magnus the Red had projected his psychic warning to Terra, he had smashed through the psychic wards protecting the webway gate within the Imperial dungeon. The result was catastrophic. The delicate machinery of the project was fused, and a rift was torn open into the warp. Through this breach, the demonic legions of the Chaos Gods poured into the tunnels the Emperor had built. For 5 years, while Horus burned the galaxy, the Emperor sat upon the Golden Throne, not as a ruler, but as a living seal. He poured his immense psychic will into holding the rift shut, preventing the demons from spilling out into the Imperial Palace and consuming Terra. Within the webway tunnels, the Legio Custodes and the Sisters of Silence fought a grinding, desperate war against an infinite tide of horrors. The 10,000, the Emperor's personal bodyguards, fought with a perfection that defied description, spinning their guardian spears in blur of adamantine, but for every demon they banished, 2 more took its place. They fought alongside the Silent Sisterhood, whose blank souls weakened the demons' hold on reality. The war in the webway was a conflict of attrition that bled the Emperor's elite dry. The tunnels, once architectural marvels of gold and psychoplastic, became choke points filled with the gore of neverborn entities. The Custodes were pushed back, mile by bloody mile, until they were fighting in sight of the Golden Throne itself. It was here that the Emperor was forced to rise one final time. In a display of power that scorched the retina of the soul, he summoned the blazing avatar of the Astronomicon and swept the tunnels clear with a tide of psychic fire. But it was a temporary reprieve. The structural integrity of the webway was gone. The Emperor ordered the gate sealed. He returned to the throne, the machinery now modified to act as a prison door, requiring his constant, unwavering focus to keep the warp at bay. The dream of a human webway was dead, and the master of mankind was now trapped on the throne, unable to take the field against his traitor son. With the Loyalist legion scattered by the ruin storm, a massive warp storm conjured by the word-bearers to cut off the Ultramarines and Dark Angels, Horus Lupercal had a clear path to the throne world. The solar war saw the defensive spheres of the Sol system fall one by one. The Alpha Legion's sabotage and the sheer weight of the traitor armada, now swollen with dark Mechanicum barks and demon ships, crushed the orbital defenses. The siege of Terra began with a bombardment that shook the tectonic plates of the planet. The skies of Terra, once blue, were choked with orbital debris and the smoke of burning hive cities, turning a bruised, sickly purple. The traitor legions made planetfall in drop pods that resembled meteors of iron and bone. They did not come alone. With the weakening of reality caused by the massive bloodshed, demons began to manifest on the soil of Terra. The Death Guard, now fully given over to Nurgle, marched as bloated, pus-filled corpses, spreading plagues that melted the defenders' flesh. The World Eaters, their armor stained the color of dried blood, threw themselves at the walls of the Imperial Palace with no regard for survival, driven only by the butcher's nails. The Emperor's children, bored with simple warfare, turned the civilian sectors into open-air torture gardens, harvesting millions of souls to fuel the chaotic rituals weakening the palace's aegis. Standing against them were the Imperial Fists, the White Scars, and the Blood Angels. Rogel Dorn had turned the Imperial Palace into the greatest fortress in galactic history. Every tower was a gun emplacement, every courtyard a kill zone. Jagatai Khan and his White Scars rode out from the walls to harass the traitor supply lines, fighting a mobile war amidst the static siege. But the heart of the defense lay with Sanguinius and the Blood Angels. The great angel fought with a tireless, tragic beauty. He knew, thanks to his foresight, that he would die in this battle, and that knowledge liberated him. He held the Eternity Gate, the final entrance to the Sanctum Imperialis, against a tide of horrors. It was at the Eternity Gate that Sanguinius faced Kabandha, the greater demon of Khorne who had previously broken the angel's legs at Cygnus Prime. This time, Sanguinius was unstoppable. He broke the demon's back across his knee and cast the beast down from the walls. Yet the physical toll was immense. The defenders were pushed back step by step. The outer walls were breached by the chaotic Titan Legios, including the Die Zeri, the Imperator Titan that had walked on Istvan III. The inner sanctum was under siege. The psychic pressure was so intense that the very air of Terra was bleeding. Angron, now a demon Primarch of Khorne, a towering monstrosity of red muscle and brass armor, led the assault on the Eternity Gate, demanding his brother Sanguinius face him. The clash of the two demigods was the stuff of myth, a battle of light and rage that ended with Angron banished back to the warp, but the cost was the near collapse of the defenders' morale. In the orbit above, the vengeful spirit, Horus's flagship, lowered its void shields. It was a taunt, an invitation. Horus, watching the battle through the eyes of the warp, knew that the Ultramarines and the Dark Angels were finally breaking through the ruin storm and approaching Terra. He had to end the siege now, or he would be crushed between the Emperor's hammer and Guilliman's anvil. He invited the Emperor to come to him. The Emperor, realizing that the palace would fall before the relief fleets arrived, accepted the gambit. He gathered Sanguinius, Rogel Dorn, and a select force of Custodes and Terminators to teleport aboard the Vengeful Spirit. The teleportation was scrambled by the chaotic energies saturating the ship. The strike force was scattered throughout the vessel, which had been twisted by the powers of chaos into a dungeon of non-Euclidean geometry and madness. Walls bled, corridors looped back on themselves, and the whispers of the dark gods echoed from the bulkheads. Sanguinius was the first to reach the bridge. There he found Horus. The War Master was no longer the charismatic brother Sanguinius had known. He was a swollen vessel of the Pantheon, his armor fused with his flesh, his face a mask of dark majesty, surrounded by the corpses of his own crew and the swirling energies of the warp. Horus offered Sanguinius a place at his side, promising that the Blood Angels would be saved if he turned. Sanguinius, battered, exhausted, and bleeding from weeks of continuous combat, refused. He drew his sword and attacked. The duel was brief. Sanguinius was one of the greatest warriors among the Primarchs, but he was weary, and Horus was empowered by all four Chaos gods. Horus battered the angel aside with the Worldbreaker mace. He caught Sanguinius in the talon of Horus, the lightning claw lifting the angel into the air. With a final squeeze, Horus snapped Sanguinius's neck and flayed his soul with psychic energy. The psychic scream of Sanguinius's death was so potent it was felt by every blood angel on Terra, instantly triggering the Black Rage, a genetic curse that would haunt the Ninth Legion forever. Moments later, the Emperor entered the bridge. He saw the broken body of his winged son lying at Horus's feet. The Emperor did not weep, he did not scream. He simply ignited his sword, a blade of pure psychic sunfire, and walked toward the monster that had been his favorite son. The battle that followed was fought on two planes of existence simultaneously. Physically, they clashed with weapons that could shatter tanks. The Emperor's sword met the talon of Horus in showers of sparks that burned the retina. Psychically, they warred in the Empyrean, hurling concepts and realities at one another. Horus, glutted on the power of the Four, was stronger. He rained blows upon the Emperor that cracked his golden armor and shattered his ribs. The Emperor, holding back, perhaps hoping that some shred of his son remained, took punishment that would have obliterated a Titan. Horus gloated, standing over the broken form of the master of mankind. He began to flay the Emperor with dark fire, dissolving his flesh, intending to torture his father to death. It was then that a lone soldier, variously identified in legend as a Terminator, a custodian, or the mortal Alanius Pews, stepped between the fallen Emperor and the War Master. Horus looked at the interloper with amusement and simply unmade him. With a glance, he obliterated the soldier, flaying his skin and soul from existence in a microsecond. Witnessing this casual cruelty, the Emperor finally understood. There was no Horus left. The soul of his son had been utterly consumed by the Chaos gods. There was nothing to save, only a monster to destroy. The Emperor cast aside his compassion. He gathered the entirety of his psychic might, drawing deep from the warp, becoming the anathema in its purest form. He focused this lance of pure order into a single strike. Horus, sensing the lethal intent, tried to defend himself, but the Chaos gods, fickle as always, recoiled from the Emperor's blinding light. The Emperor's psychic lance pierced Horus's armor and burned into his very essence. It did not just kill his body, it scoured his soul. The Emperor poured his power into the War Master, erasing him from the timeline, burning his spirit so completely that the Chaos gods could never resurrect him. Horus Lupercal died screaming, his existence ending in a flash of blinding white light that blew out the windows of the bridge. The backlash of the duel left the Emperor a ruined husk. His body was scorched, his arm severed, his eye socket empty. Rogel Dorn, finally fighting his way to the bridge, found his father lying amidst the ashes of his brother. The Praetorian, usually so stoic, wept as he carried the Emperor's broken body back to the teleportarium. They returned to the Sanctum Imperialis. The Emperor, clinging to life by a thread of will, whispered his final instructions to Dorn. The Golden Throne, once intended to be the gateway to the webway, must now become his life support machine. He had to be interred upon it immediately to keep the webway rift closed and to project the Astronomicon, without which the Imperium would be lost in the dark. Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's regent and oldest friend, had been sitting on the throne to buy the Emperor time to fight Horus. As the tech priests removed Malcador to place the Emperor on the seat, the Sigillite's body crumbled to dust, his life force entirely consumed by the psychic strain. The Emperor was connected to the arcane machinery. Then, the golden doors closed. The Master of Mankind became the Carrion Lord of the Imperium, a silent watcher trapped in an eternal nightmare, fed by the souls of 1,000 psychers a day to keep his dying light alive. The siege was broken, the traitors were fleeing, but the Imperium they left behind was a corpse, rotting slowly from the inside out. The closing of the Golden Throne's adamantine gates did not mark the end of the violence. Rather, it signaled a shift from desperate defense to a campaign of vengeance, so absolute it would scar the galaxy for 10 millennia. The siege of Terra was broken, but the traitor legions were not destroyed. They were a rooted, disorganized mob, fleeing the Sol system before the arrival of the full might of the Ultramarines. Robute Guilliman, the Primarch of the 13th Legion, arrived to find the throne world in ruins, his father interred upon a life support engine of incomprehensible complexity, and his brother Sanguinius dead. Dorn was broken, a shadow of the stoic Praetorian, consumed by the guilt of his failure to protect the Emperor. In this vacuum of leadership, Guilliman took the mantle of Lord Commander of the Imperium. He did not have time to grieve. The traitors were running, and they had to be hunted down before they could regroup. Thus began the Great Scouring. It was a period that lasted roughly 7 years, though its ripples were felt for decades. The Loyalist legions, fueled by a hatred that transcended mere military duty, launched themselves into the void. This was not a war of compliance or conquest. It was a war of extermination. The World Eaters, fragmented and lost to the Butcher's nails, were chased from system to system, leaving trails of butchered populations in their wake until they were cornered and driven into the Great Eye. The Death Guard, retreating to the Plague Planet, fought a fighting withdrawal that turned entire sectors into quarantined dead zones. The Emperor's children, having exhausted the civilian population of Terra for their horrific amusements, raided the slave worlds of the Segmentum Solar, stealing millions of souls to fuel their debauchery in exile. Guilliman coordinated this galactic counter-offensive with the cold, logistical brilliance that was his hallmark. He reorganized the shattered Imperial army and the battered remnants of the Mechanicum, pushing the front lines away from Terra and back toward the galactic rim. The traitors were pushed relentlessly toward the Eye of Terror, the massive warp rift that had birthed Slaanesh. They were hounded by the vengeful space wolves and the bitter Iron Hands, who exacted a heavy toll in blood for every light year surrendered. The traitors eventually crossed the threshold into the Immaterium, surrendering their sanity completely to the Chaos Gods in exchange for sanctuary. The Imperium could not follow them there. The laws of physics dissolved within the Eye, and to enter was to court madness. The Scouring had saved the Imperium's physical territory, but it had failed to deliver the killing blow. While the galaxy burned with the fires of retribution, a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions was unfolding on the far side of the galaxy. The Dark Angels, the First Legion, had been absent from the Siege of Terra due to the machinations of the Night Lords and the Ruinstorm. Their Primarch, Lion L. Johnson, burned with shame at having missed the defense of his father. He led his fleet back to his homeworld of Caliban, intending to rest and refit before joining the Scouring. However, as the fleet broke orbit, they were met not with salutes, but with weapons fire. Luther, the Lion's foster father and second in command, had been left behind on Caliban decades earlier to oversee the training of recruits. Over the years, resentment and the whispering influence of the warp, channeled through the tainted forests of Caliban, had corrupted him. He had rallied the garrison and the new recruits against the Lion, claiming the Primarch had abandoned them and that the Emperor was a tyrant who would destroy Caliban's knightly traditions. The Lion, already on the edge of reason due to the events of the heresy, did not hesitate. He ordered the fleet to bombard his own homeworld. The surface of Caliban was cracked open by lance strikes and cyclonic torpedoes. The forests burned and the fortress monasteries crumbled. Amidst the orbital bombardment, the Lion descended to the surface to face Luthor. The duel between the two was apocalyptic. They fought in the ruins of the Tower of Angels, the Primarch's physical perfection matched by the sorcerous power the Chaos Gods had poured into Luthor. The battle shattered the tectonic stability of the planet. In the final moments, Luthor, seeing the Lion broken and defenseless, had a moment of clarity. He realized the depth of his betrayal and dropped his weapon, weeping. But the Chaos Gods, denied their prize, screamed in frustration. A warp storm of unprecedented intensity erupted around Caliban. The planet, already weakened by the bombardment, tore itself apart. The debris was sucked into the warp, along with the fallen angels who had sided with Luthor. The Lion vanished, lost in the cataclysm, while Luthor was found babbling and broken in the ruins of the Rock, the largest surviving fragment of the planet, which the Dark Angels would convert into their mobile fortress monastery. Back in the core sectors, the political landscape of the Imperium was shifting. Robute Guilliman looked at the devastation of the heresy and saw a structural flaw in the Emperor's design: the legions themselves. The power of a Space Marine Legion, numbering tens or hundreds of thousands of transhuman warriors under the command of a single individual, was too great. If a Primarch turned, he took an army with him capable of threatening the throne world. To ensure that no single person could ever wield that much power again, Guilliman authored the Codex Astartes. The central tenet of the Codex was the breaking of the legions. They were to be split into chapters of 1,000 warriors. One chapter would retain the name, colors, and heraldry of the original legion, while the rest would become successor chapters, with new names and liveries. This proposal nearly caused a second civil war. Leman Russ of the Space Wolves spat on the idea. Vulcan of the Salamanders was reluctant, but the fiercest opposition came from Rogel Dorn. The Imperial Fists had defended Terra. They had bled more than anyone, and Dorn viewed the breakup of his legion as an insult to their loyalty and a weakening of the Imperium's defenses. The tension between Guilliman and Dorn escalated until the Imperial Fist's navy was fired upon by the Imperial Navy. It was only the Iron Cage incident that broke Dorn's resolve. In a final act of stubbornness, Dorn led his legion against the eternal fortress of the Iron Warriors, a trap set by Perturabo. The Imperial Fists were chewed up in the meat grinder of the fortress, lacking the ammunition and support to win, refusing to retreat. They suffered horrific casualties. It was a purgative ordeal, a pain glove on a legionary scale. Dorn emerged from the Iron Cage carrying the bodies of his sons, his spirit tempered. He accepted the Codex Astartes. The Imperial Fists were split. The most zealous and aggressive brethren became the Black Templars under High Marshal Sigismund, embarking on an eternal crusade. The younger, more level-headed initiates formed the Crimson Fists. The second founding was complete, and the era of the legions was over. For 1,000 years, the Imperium stabilized. The High Lords of Terra ruled in the Emperor's name, and the Astartes chapters guarded the borders. But in the 32nd millennium, complacency nearly led to extinction. The War of the Beast erupted with a violence that made the raids of the traitor legions seem like skirmishes. The threat was the orcs, but not the disorganized rabble the Imperium was used to. These were evolved orcs, larger, smarter, and more technologically advanced than anything seen since Ulanor. They were led by a singular entity known as the Beast, a prime orc who stood as tall as a dreadnought and possessed an intellect that rivaled a Primarch. The Beastwa did not just invade, it dominated. They utilized attack moons, celestial bodies hollowed out and weaponized with gravity whips and city-sized energy cannons. These moons could travel through subspace tunnels, bypassing Imperial defenses. One of these moons appeared directly over Terra. The psychological impact was devastating. The High Lords were paralyzed. The orcs sent ambassadors to the Senatorum Imperialis, hulking brutes who spoke perfect High Gothic, demanding the unconditional surrender of humanity. The arrogance and terror of the moment broke the minds of the terrifyingly inadequate administration. The defense of the Imperium fell to Courland, the last surviving member of the Imperial Fists chapter, which had been wiped out almost to a man on the planet Ardamantua. Courland invoked the Last Wall Protocol, a secret contingency that called all the successor chapters of the Imperial Fists to gather as a single legion once more. The Fists, the Black Templars, the Crimson Fists, the Soul Drinkers, and others united to save Terra. It was a desperate conflict that saw the return of the Primarch Vulcan, who had been missing for centuries. Vulcan led a strike team into the heart of the Beast's throne room on the attack moon. The Primarch grappled with the Beast, realizing the Orc was too strong to be beaten by conventional arms. Vulcan grabbed the Beast and threw them both into the reactant core of the moon's generator. The explosion vaporized the Beast and seemingly the Primarch, though as a perpetual, Vulcan's true death remained uncertain. Even with the Beast dead, the war was not over. The political rot on Terra was exposed. The High Lord Draken Vangorich, the Grand Master of the Office of Assassins, saw that the bureaucracy had nearly doomed the species. In an event known as the Beheading, Vangorich unleashed his assassins to slaughter the other High Lords in a single night of blood. He ruled as a tyrant for nearly a century, trying to rebuild the Imperium's strength, until he too succumbed to madness and was put down by a strike force of Space Marines. The War of the Beast resulted in the creation of the Death Watch, a specialized chamber militant of the Inquisition composed of veterans from different chapters, dedicated solely to the study and extermination of xenos threats. The Imperium limped on, but the seeds of corruption were deep within the ecclesiarchy, the church dedicated to the worship of the god Emperor. By the 36th millennium, the ecclesiarchy had become a bloated, all-powerful state within a state. It controlled vast wealth, private armies, and held sway over the High Lords. This accumulation of power culminated in the rise of Goj Vander, the 361st High Lord of the Administratum. Through bribery, assassination, and blackmail, Vander managed to secure the position of ecclesiarch as well, becoming the dual ruler of both the secular and spiritual arms of the Imperium. Vander was not just power-hungry, he was insane. The reign of blood began. He purged the ecclesiarchy of anyone who opposed him, burning cardinals and bishops by the dozen. He raised taxes to impossible levels to fund his opulent palaces and statues. Worlds that could not pay were subjected to exterminatus. The Imperium began to fracture, with sector after sector rebelling against the tyranny of Terra. During this time, Vander discovered a small, all-female cult on the agri-world of San'Leer known as the Daughters of the Emperor. These warrior women practiced martial arts and worshipped the Emperor with pure, unadulterated faith. Vander visited them, and when they questioned his divinity, he tricked them. He used a Resarius force field, a piece of archaeotech, to shrug off Allah's bolt fired by one of the daughters. The women, not understanding the technology, viewed this as a miracle and pledged their lives to him. They became his personal bodyguards, the brides of the Emperor. They were the only people Vander trusted, and they ruthlessly executed his will, serving as his executioners within the Imperial Palace. While Vander descended further into madness, whispering to the severed head of his predecessor and ordering fleets to fire on stars that looked at him wrong, a light rose in the darkness. On the world of Dimammer, a preacher named Sebastian Thor began to speak out against the High Lord. Thor was a charismatic orator who claimed that Vander had betrayed the Emperor. He founded the Confederation of Light. The movement spread like wildfire. Millions of citizens, Imperial Guard regiments, and even Space Marine chapters rallied to Thor's banner. A massive Crusade fleet began the long journey to Terra to depose the tyrant. The siege of the ecclesiarchal palace was the final act of the Age of Apostasy. Vander had fortified his palace on Terra to withstand a siege of years. The Imperial Fists and the Fire Hawks bombarded the walls, but the defenses held. The brides of the Emperor fought with fanatical devotion, cutting down Astartes in the corridors of the palace. The stalemate seemed unbreakable, and the bloodshed on the throne world was catastrophic. It was the Adeptus Custodes who ended it. The centurions of the Emperor's bodyguard had watched the madness from the sanctity of the inner palace, bound by their oaths not to interfere in the political squabbles of the High Lords. But Vandar's insanity now threatened the safety of the Golden Throne itself. A small team of custodes, utilizing secret passages known only to them, infiltrated the ecclesiarchal palace. They did not attack Vander, they made for the quarters of the brides of the Emperor. The custodes appeared before Alicia Dominica, the leader of the brides. They did not fight her. Instead, the centurion urged her to lay down her arms. When she refused, claiming loyalty to the Emperor through Vander, the Custodes made an unprecedented offer. They would take her and her lieutenants to see the emperor. What happened inside the Sanctum Imperialis remains one of the greatest secrets of the Imperium. Dominica and her sisters were led before the Golden Throne. They looked upon the shriveled, psychic corpse of the master of mankind. They felt the agony of his existence and the silent judgment of his presence. The veil of Vandar's lies was torn away. They saw the truth. They had been serving a monster in the name of a god. Dominica emerged from the sanctum. Her hair turned stark white from the psychic trauma of being in the emperor's presence. She marched her sisters directly to Vandar's audience chamber. The High Lord was in the midst of a rant, studying a map of the galaxy and ordering the destruction of more worlds. He turned to see his bodyguards approaching, weapons drawn. He demanded to know what they were doing. Alicia Dominica read out his crimes and pronounced the sentence of death. Vandar, in his delusion, sneered at them. He touched the Rosarius at his neck, believing he was invincible. "I don't have time to die," he snarled. "I'm too busy." Dominica did not hesitate. She swung her power sword, severing Vandar's head from his shoulders. The Rosarius overloaded, and the tyrant fell. With his death, the reign of blood ended. The ecclesiarchy was reformed under Sebastian Thor, who became the 292nd ecclesiarch. To prevent the church from ever holding such military power again, the decree passive was passed, forbidding the ecclesiarchy from maintaining men under arms. However, the new hierarchy found a linguistic loophole. The brides of the emperor were reorganized and renamed. They were women, not men. Thus, the Adepta Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle, were officially founded to serve as the militant arm of the church, ensuring that the faith was defended, but never again used to tyrannize the faithful. The galaxy breathed a collective sigh of relief, but the peace was fragile, for the 41st millennium was approaching, and the shadows were lengthening once more. Following the reformation of the ecclesiarchy and the end of the age of apostasy, the Imperium of man settled into a long, grinding stagnation. For nearly 5,000 years, humanity held the line, fighting a war of attrition against the scattered warbands of the traitor legions and the feral orc empires that infested the void. The bureaucracy of the Adeptus Terra calcified, and the technological understanding of the Adeptus Mechanicus devolved further into ritual and superstition. The Imperium became a colossal machine that ran on momentum and human suffering, convinced of its own eternal supremacy. But as the 41st millennium dawned, the galaxy began to convulse. The threats that emerged were not merely rebels or ancient rivals, but existential horrors that challenged the very premise of human survival. The first of these came not from the Eye of Terror, but from the intergalactic void, a darkness so profound it swallowed the light of the Astronomicon. The arrival of the Tyranids marked a fundamental shift in the galactic paradigm. For millennia, the Imperium had looked inward or toward the eye, believing the galaxy ended at the halo stars. They were wrong. In the year 745 of the 41st millennium, the Tyranid Primus Outpost, a Mechanicus research station on the extreme southeastern fringe, went silent. The tech priest Magos Varnak managed to send a single data codex before the end, a record of a biological storm that consumed all life. The entity was named after the planet it first devoured, Tyran. This was the onset of Hive Fleet Behemoth. The Tyranids were unlike any xenos species humanity had encountered. They were not a civilization in the traditional sense. They were a superorganism, a galactic predator driven by an insatiable hunger for biomass. They did not conquer territory for resources or ideology. They stripped worlds down to bedrock, drinking the oceans and atmosphere, leaving behind dead, airless rocks. Preceding their physical arrival was the shadow in the warp, a psychic phenomenon caused by the sheer volume of the hive mind synaptic network. This psychic static blocked astropathic communication and drove navigators insane, effectively isolating target systems before the first spore pod made planetfall. The first major test of the Imperium against this new horror was the battle for Muck Crag. Hive Fleet Behemoth drove straight into the heart of the realm of Ultramar, the dominion of the Ultramarines. Marnius Calgar, the chapter master, mobilized the entire strength of the Ultramar system. The space battle was a meat grinder. The Tyranid bioships, massive living constructs with ribbed carapaces and weapon symbiotes that fired acidic pyro acid, clashed with the elegant cruisers of the Imperial Navy. The Tyranids did not care for losses. They simply rammed Imperial ships, boarding them with swarms of genestealers and gaunts. On the surface of Crag, the fighting was apocalyptic. The Tyranids made planetfall at the polar fortresses. The veteran First Company of the Ultramarines, the finest warriors in the chapter clad in Terminator armor, held the northern fortress. They fought against a tide of chitin and muscle that numbered in the millions. Hormagaunts, scything talons clicking, threw themselves into the fire of storm bolters until the dead were piled high enough to scale the walls. Carnifexes, living battering rams, smashed through adamantine gates. The Terminators fought back to back, their power fists crushing alien skulls, their assault cannons glowing white-hot. They sold their lives dearly, buying time for the fleet above. When the relief force finally broke through to the polar fortress, they found a scene of absolute carnage. The First Company was wiped out to a man, their bodies forming a circle around the banner they had died defending, surrounded by mountains of xenos corpses. Behemoth was eventually stopped, but only through a Pyrrhic victory. The battleship Dominus Astra detonated its warp drives in the heart of the Tyranid fleet, creating a vortex that sucked the bioships into oblivion. The Imperium breathed a sigh of relief, believing the threat ended. They were catastrophically mistaken. Behemoth was merely a scout force. Less than 3 centuries later, Hive Fleet Kraken arrived. Unlike the brute force of Behemoth, Kraken was insidious. It attacked from multiple vectors, splintering into hundreds of smaller fleets that bypassed strongholds to feast on undefended worlds. This war saw the rise of the Genestealer cults, fifth column insurgents who had infected human populations decades prior, rising up to sabotage planetary defenses just as the Hive fleet arrived. The tragedy of the Scythes of the Emperor chapter occurred during this war. Their homeworld of Satha was overrun, the chapter virtually annihilated by the relentless adaptation of the Tyranids. At Ikar 4, the Ultramarines faced the beast again, this time utilizing the knowledge of Chaplain Cassius, a survivor of the First War, to counter the hive mind's tactics. Then came Leviathan. Arriving late in the 41st millennium, this fleet did not attack from the galactic rim, but pushed up from below the galactic plane, catching the Imperium's defenses completely off guard. The scale of Leviathan was so vast that it threatened to envelop the segmentum solar itself. It was during this desperate hour that Inquisitor Kryptman, declared a radical and a traitor by many, enacted his most controversial gambit. Realizing the Imperium could not stop Leviathan through force of arms alone, he created a cordon of dead worlds, performing exterminatus on dozens of inhabited planets to starve the fleet. He then captured a brood of genestealers and launched them into the Octarius sector, an area of space dominated by a massive orc empire. The Tyranids followed the bait. The resulting Octarius War became a biological cataclysm, pitting the endless hunger of the Tyranids against the endless aggression of the orcs, locking two of the galaxy's greatest threats in a stalemate that bought the Imperium precious time, even as it created a crucible that forged ever stronger variants of both species. While the biological horror of the Tyranids consumed the Eastern Rim, a colder, more ancient threat was stirring beneath the crust of thousands of worlds. The Necrons were waking up. For 60 million years, the Necron dynasties had slumbered in their stasis crypts, waiting for the galaxy to recover from the war in heaven. The Great Awakening was not a simultaneous event, but a staggered, disjointed resurrection caused by the failure of stasis protocols and the probing of unwitting explorers. The first ominous sign of their return in the modern era occurred in the Vidar sector at Sanctuary 101, a fortress convent of the Adepta Sororitas. The Sisters of Battle reported contact with silver-skinned raiders who emerged from the desert sands. These attackers did not speak, did not panic, and did not stop. Their weapons, glowing with emerald energy, did not just burn flesh. They flayed atoms, stripping targets layer by layer until nothing remained. The video logs recovered later showed the sisters fighting with faith and bolter, only to be systematically dismantled by the implacable advance of the Necron warriors. Sanctuary 101 was left a silent tomb, the first of many. As the 41st millennium progressed, more tomb worlds activated. The Imperium, initially classifying these encounters as isolated xenos raids, soon realized they were facing a galaxy-spanning empire that had been there all along. On worlds where humans had lived for generations, the ground would suddenly split open, revealing colossal ziggurats of black stone rising from the bedrock. The Necrons did not invade from the stars. They evicted the tenants living on their property. This era saw the return of the Silent King, Zarek. He had spent millions of years in the intergalactic void, seeking penance for damning his race to a soulless existence. In the darkness between galaxies, he had encountered the Tyranids. He saw the sleeping fleets of the Great Devourer, a mass of biological matter larger than the galaxy itself, slowly moving toward the Milky Way. Realizing that the Tyranids would consume all biomass, and thus destroy any hope of the Necrons ever reversing biotransference to regain organic bodies, Zarek ended his exile. He returned to the galaxy to unite the fractured Necron dynasties. He found his people in disarray, with overlords fighting petty wars of dominance. The Sautek dynasty, led by the brilliant strategist Emotic the Stormlord, had carved out a massive empire, but Emotic refused to bow to the returning king. The Necrons were a race divided, their technological supremacy matched only by their internal rivalries, yet their awakening fundamentally altered the balance of power. They possessed technology that could dampen the warp, seal the Great Rift, or shatter stars, making them the only faction capable of truly ending the threat of chaos, though their solution would likely involve the sterilization of all life. In the eastern fringe, wedged between the encroaching darkness of the Tyranids and the slumbering menace of the Necrons, a young, dynamic empire was rising. The Tau were a naive anomaly in the grim darkness of the far future. Only 6,000 years prior, they had been savages mastering fire and the wheel. Now they were a space-faring civilization with technology that rivaled, and in some areas surpassed, the Adeptus Mechanicus. United by the philosophy of the greater good, the Tava, and ruled by the mysterious ethereal caste, the Tau believed in progress, logic, and the integration of other species into their empire. The Tau expansion was organized into spheres. The first sphere expansion saw them colonize their immediate star systems. The second sphere expansion brought them into direct conflict with the Imperium. The Damocles Gulf Crusade was the Imperium's response to this upstart race. Imperial commanders, initially dismissive of the xenos primitives, were shocked by the combat effectiveness of the Tau fire caste. The Tau did not fight like orcs or Eldari. They fought with coordinated long-range firepower. Their hammerhead gunships mounted railguns that could punch a solid slug through the front armor of a Liman Russ battle tank from kilometers away. Their crisis battle suits, piloted by veterans, utilized jump-shoot-jump tactics that frustrated the static trench warfare doctrines of the Imperial Guard. The Crusade bogged down. The Imperium, expecting a quick extermination campaign, found themselves bleeding men and machines against a highly mobile, technologically advanced enemy that refused to engage in glorious melee combat. The conflict introduced the Imperium to Commander Farsight, Shasso Viorlashova, a tactical genius who utilized aggression and close quarters battlesuit drops to counter the Astartes. However, the Crusade was cut short not by Tau victory, but by the arrival of Hive Fleet Behemoth, which forced the Imperium to redeploy its forces. In the aftermath, Commander Farsight became a figure of legend and controversy. During an expedition to the Arthas Moloch system, Farsight encountered demons of chaos and recovered the Dawn Blade, a xenos artifact that extended his lifespan by stealing the chronal energy of his victims. Disillusioned by the Ethereals, whom he suspected of mind control and hiding the true nature of the warp, Farsight broke away from the Tau Empire. He established the Farsight Enclaves, a military junta independent of the Ethereals' control. Meanwhile, the Tau Empire continued to push outward under the leadership of Commander Shadowsun, initiating the Third Sphere expansion. They crossed the Damocles Gulf, utilizing new technology to bypass Imperial blockades and set the stage for a major confrontation with the realm of Ultramar. The Tau represented a unique threat. They offered human populations a better life. On worlds where citizens toiled in squalor for a distant emperor, the Tau offered technology, food, and purpose. For the first time, the Imperium faced an enemy that could conquer its worlds not just with guns, but with ideas. While Xenos threats battered the borders, the rot within the Imperium festered, culminating in the Badab War. This conflict, fought between 901 and 912 of the 41st millennium, stands as a grim testament to the bureaucratic decay and feudal arrogance that plagued the Adeptus Astartes. It was not initially a war of chaos, but a war over taxes, sovereignty, and the ego of one man, Luft-Huron, the chapter master of the astral claws and the self-styled tyrant of Badab. The Maelstrom Zone, a massive warp storm and pirate haven near the galactic core, had always been a thorn in the Imperium's side. The Astral Claws were the leaders of the Maelstrom Warders, a coalition of chapters tasked with guarding this volatile region. Huron was a capable, charismatic leader who felt that the High Lords of Terra were ignoring the strategic importance of the Maelstrom. He argued that the resources stripped from his sector as imperial tithes were needed to maintain the defenses against the pirates and xenos raiders. When his petitions were ignored by the Administratum, Huron took matters into his own hands. He withheld the gene seed tithe and stopped sending resources to Terra, effectively declaring the Badab sector an autonomous zone. The Imperium does not tolerate secession. The administrative dispute escalated into a shooting war when Huron ordered the destruction of an Imperial investigation fleet. He rallied other chapters to his cause, the Mantis Warriors, the Lamenters, and the Executioners, convincing them that he was defending the ancient rights of the Astartes against the corrupt, interfering bureaucrats of Terra. The conflict drew in loyalist chapters to restore order, including the Fire Hawks, the Marines Errant, and eventually the brutal Carcharoddons and the Minotaurs. The war was a grinding, fratricidal tragedy. Space Marine fought Space Marine in the void and on the surface of industrial worlds. The Lamenters, ever the victims of misfortune, were caught in a trap by the Minotaurs and forced to surrender after taking horrific casualties. The Executioners, bound by blood oaths to Huron, fought with honor but were eventually convinced to stand down by the intervention of the Salamanders and the ghostly intrigue of the Legion of the Damned. The climax of the war took place at the Palace of Thorns on Badab Primaris, Huron's fortress monastery. The Star Phantoms chapter led the siege, breaching the defenses in a drop-pod assault. In the final battles, Luft-Huron fought with the desperation of a cornered animal. He was critically wounded by a melta-blast from a Star Phantom's captain, which obliterated half of his body. The Astral Claws, refusing to let their master die, dragged his broken form onto a Thunderhawk and fled into the Maelstrom. The Badab War stripped the Imperium of hundreds of loyal Astartes and devastated a vital industrial sector, but its legacy was far darker. Inside the Maelstrom, Huron survived. He made a pact with the ruinous powers to sustain his life, his destroyed flesh replaced with bionics and warp-forged machinery. He became Huron Blackheart, and the survivors of the Astral Claws became the Red Corsairs. Unlike the ancient traitor legions who fought the Long War for vengeance, the Red Corsairs were pirates and renegades who accepted any space marine who turned his back on the Imperium. They grew rapidly, becoming a pirate empire that rivaled the Black Legion in size, a constant reminder that the Imperium's greatest enemy was often its own internal corruption. As the 41st millennium drew to a close, the galaxy was a powder keg. The Tyranids were consuming the east, the Necrons were rising from the ground beneath, the Tau were expanding with dangerous optimism, and the Imperium was tearing itself apart in civil wars like Badab. The Golden Throne was failing, the light of the astronomic flickering. The forces of chaos, watching from the Eye of Terror, saw that the time was finally right. Abaddon the Despoiler, Warmaster of Chaos, had launched 12 Black Crusades, each one a strategic strike against the pylons and structures that held the Cadian Gate closed. He was preparing for the 13th, the final blow that would shatter the gate and spill the warp across the galaxy. The stage was set for the darkest hour in human history, the time of ending, where the heroes of legend would return, and the galaxy would be torn in half. The closing years of the 41st millennium did not fade quietly. They screamed into the darkness, heralded by a convergence of catastrophes that threatened to extinguish the human species entirely. While the Tyranids consumed the biomass of the eastern fringe, and the Necrons awoke from their eons-long slumber to reclaim their stolen galaxy, the true architect of humanity's demise was finalizing a plan 10,000 years in the making. Abaddon the Despoiler, the Warmaster of Chaos and heir to Horus Lupercal, had spent the long millennia since the heresy launching 12 Black Crusades. To the High Lords of Terra, these appeared as isolated, if devastating, campaigns of plunder and destruction. This was a fatal miscalculation. Abaddon was not merely a warlord seeking glory, He was a methodical saboteur, dismantling the cosmic cage that held the warp at bay. The Cadian Gate was the single most strategically vital system in the Imperium. It was the only stable route out of the Eye of Terror, a corridor of calm space flanked by the shifting madness of the warp. Its stability was maintained by the Cadian pylons, immense, inert structures of black stone that predated humanity, vibrating with a null field that repelled the Immaterium. Abaddon knew that to conquer the galaxy, he did not need to besiege Terra immediately. He needed to break the gate. If the pylons fell, the Eye would expand, and the material universe would drown in the Sea of Souls. The 13th Black Crusade began not with a single battle, but with a tidal wave of corruption that overwhelmed the sectors surrounding the gate. Cultist uprisings, plague outbreaks, and demonic incursions stretched the defenses of the Cadian sector to the breaking point. Then, the Despoiler's armada arrived. It was a fleet of nightmares, a congregation of twisted hulls and demon ships that blotted out the stars. At its heart sailed the Vengeful Spirit, the ancient flagship of Horus, and the Will of Eternity, a Blackstone fortress, one of the ancient, star-killing stations of Eldari and Old One design, corrupted to serve the ruinous powers. The initial assault on Cadia was cataclysmic. The Will of Eternity did not engage in a conventional bombardment. It utilized its primary weapon, a beam of concentrated warp energy, to strip the planetary shields and obliterate the holy fortress of Kasser Kraf. The planetary defense grid, the best the Imperium could muster, was overwhelmed. The sky above Cadia turned a bruised, sickly purple as the barrier between realities began to thin. On the surface, the Cadian shock troopers, the most disciplined mortal soldiers in the galaxy, dug into the gray dust of their homeworld. Led by Lord Castellan Ursarkar Creed, a tactical genius whose gruff demeanor hid a mind sharp enough to outmaneuver Astartes, the defenders prepared to sell their lives for every inch of ground. The ground war was a meat grinder of industrial proportions. Traitor Astartes from the Black Legion, the Death Guard, the World Eaters, and the Word Bearers made planetfall in Dreadclaw drop pods, followed by tides of cultists and demons. They were met by the massed lasgun fire of millions of Cadians, the thunder of Leman Russ battle tanks, and the heavy bolters of the Space Wolves, led by the ferocious wolf Lord Sven Bloodhowl. The Elysian Fields, a vast plain filled with the pylons, became the focal point of the battle. The ground turned to mud, churned by tank treads and saturated with blood. Space was no safer. The Imperial Navy, outgunned and outnumbered, fought a desperate holding action. The turning point in the void came with the arrival of the Phalanx. The mobile fortress monastery of the Imperial Fists, a moon-sized station of golden armor and guns, dropped out of the warp. It had been severely damaged in previous conflicts, but its firepower remained apocalyptic. In a daring maneuver, the Space Wolves boarded the Will of Eternity to disable its shields, allowing the Phalanx to unleash a broadside that shattered the Blackstone fortress. The station, a weapon capable of killing stars, was broken, its debris raining down into the atmosphere. On the surface, the situation was dire. The Despoiler himself had taken the field. Abaddon, clad in the Terminator armor of the War Master, and wielding the Talon of Horus and the demon sword Drachnian, was an unstoppable force of destruction. He sought to physically destroy the pylons that the orbital bombardment had failed to level. Standing against him were the heroes of the age. Saint Celestine, the living saint, manifested from the warp on wings of holy fire, her Gemini Superia fighting at her side. She engaged Abaddon in a duel of faith against hatred, her ardent blade clashing against the demon weapon of the War Master. Even the ancient Necron overlord, Trazyn the Infinite, intervened. Motivated by the desire to preserve his favorite exhibit, the Imperium and the galaxy itself, from total chaotic consumption, Trazyn opened his Tesseract labyrinths. He unleashed reinforcements from his collection onto the battlefield, detachments of Horus Heresy era Ultramarines, Vestroyan Firstborn, and even a Custodian Guard, throwing them into the fray to halt the Black Legion's advance. Amidst this chaos, Archmagos Belisarius Call, a tech priest of ancient provenance who had served the Emperor since the Great Crusade, was working on a desperate gambit. He had studied the pylons and understood their true function. They were not just monuments, they were a network. With the help of Trajan's knowledge of necrodermis, Call interfaced with the pylons beneath the Elysian fields. He intended to overcharge them, to push the null field into overdrive and banish the warp storm engulfing the system. As Call activated the network, a wave of green, negation energy swept across the planet. The effect was immediate and violent. The demons, creatures of pure warp stuff, flickered and vanished, banished back to the Imperium. The psychic powers of the traitor sorcerers were snuffed out. Even the Eye of Terror in the sky began to shrink. However, the pylons also affected the Imperials. The Legion of the Damned vanished, and Saint Celestine's power waned, leaving her mortal and vulnerable. Abaddon, realizing his connection to the Chaos Gods was being severed, was forced to retreat to the Vengeful Spirit via teleportation before the pylons completely cut him off. The Imperium had technically won the battle. The Black Legion was retreating, the demons were gone, and the pylons were closing the eye. But Abaddon possessed a spite that transcended strategic logic. From the bridge of his flagship, he looked down at the defiant world that had denied him for 10,000 years. He ordered the systems of the fragmented will of eternity to be reactivated. The massive shards of the destroyed Blackstone fortress, some the size of continents, were equipped with plasma drives. Abaddon drove them into the surface of Cadia. The impact was an extinction event. The tectonic plates of Cadia shattered. The pylons, delicate in their own way, crumbled under the geological upheaval. The null field collapsed instantly. With the pylons gone, the Eye of Terror did not just return, it exploded outward. The planet began to break apart, magma welling up through the cracks in the crust. The planet broke before the guard did. This phrase would become the epitaph of Cadia. Even as the world disintegrated beneath their boots, the Cadian regiments continued to fire at the retreating traitor ships. Lord Castellan Creed ordered a general evacuation, staying behind to cover the retreat of the transport ships. He was eventually swallowed by the light of Trajan's Tesseract Labyrinth, added to the Necron's collection in the final moments of the planet's life, preserved forever as the defiant soldier. The destruction of Cadia was the catalyst for a galactic disaster. The pylons of the Cadian Gate were the keystone of the network that kept the warp separate from real space. When they fell, a chain reaction rippled across the galaxy. The Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, tore the galaxy in half. It was a scar of multicolored madness that stretched from the Eye of Terror in the west to the Hadex anomaly in the east. The rift unleashed a spiritual shockwave that momentarily extinguished the light of the Astronomicon. For weeks, perhaps months, time became meaningless. The Imperium was plunged into the Noctis Aeterna, the days of blindness. Every world in the Imperium was isolated, cut off from astropathic communication and warp travel. Demons manifested on millions of planets as reality buckled. When the light of the Astronomicon finally flickered back into existence, the galaxy had been fundamentally redrawn. The Imperium was now two realms. To the south of the rift lay Imperium Sanctus, the half of the galaxy that included Terra. Here, the Astronomicon could still be seen, and navigation was possible, though hazardous. To the north lay Imperium Nihilus, the Dark Imperium. In this vast region, the light of the Emperor was blocked by the wall of warp storms. Thousands of human worlds were left in total darkness, beset by the horrors of the warp, with no way to call for help and no way for Terra to reach them. In the midst of this apocalypse, a small fleet of survivors from Cadia fled into the void, hunted by the Black Legion. Among them were Saint Celestine, Inquisitor Catarina Greyfax, and Archmagos Belisarius Call. They carried with them a precious cargo, an auto-reliquary of immense technological complexity. Call was on a mission that had been given to him by the Primarch Robute Guilliman 10,000 years prior, a task he had labored on in secret for millennia. The survivors were cornered in the Callisis system by the pursuing traitors. Just as annihilation seemed certain, they were saved by the arrival of the Eldari. These were not the Craftworlders or the Drukari of old, but a new faction, the Inari. Led by Ivrain, the emissary of Ennead, the Eldari god of the dead, they sought to unite their fractured race against chaos. Ivrain saw in the humans a necessary bulwark against the great enemy. She offered them passage through the webway, a method of travel that bypassed the warp storms churning through real space. The alliance was uneasy. Greyfax viewed the Xenos with suspicion, and the Black Templars accompanying the Crusade were barely restrained from attacking their saviors. Yet the necessity of survival drove them forward. They traveled through the labyrinthine dimension of the webway, emerging in the realm of Ultramar, directly into the Mukrag system. Ultramar was burning. The forces of chaos, sensing the weakness of the Imperium, had launched a massive invasion. The Black Legion, supported by the Iron Warriors and demonic hosts, was besieging the Fortress of Hera, the holiest site on Mukrag, where the body of Roboute Guilliman sat in stasis. The Primarch of the Ultramarines had been struck down by Fulgrim's poisoned blade shortly after the Horus Heresy, kept alive only by a stasis field that froze him in the moment of dying. The survivors fought their way to the shrine. Marnius Calgar, the chapter master of the Ultramarines, was holding the line against the traitor assault, but the defenders were being pushed back. Call revealed his purpose. He intended to resurrect the Primarch. He had constructed the Armor of Fate, a suit of power armor that incorporated life support systems capable of healing the Primarch's wounds and filtering the poison from his blood. However, the technology alone was not enough. The poison of the demon blade was spiritual as well as biological. This was where Yvraine stepped in. She claimed that the power of Ennead could restore the Primarch's soul to his body. The ritual required the stasis field to be lowered, effectively killing Guilliman before he could be brought back. Calgar, faced with the destruction of his chapter and the blasphemy of xenos touching his gene sire, made the agonizing decision to allow it. The stasis field was deactivated. For a moment, Roboute Guilliman died. His throat, slashed open millennia ago, bled fresh blood. The auto-reliquary descended, encasing his body in the armor of fate. Call initiated the revitalization protocols while Yvraine channeled the energies of the dead god, cutting the thread of the poison that anchored Guilliman to his death. The shrine shook as the Black Legion breached the inner sanctum. Chaos Terminators and sorcerers poured in, slaughtering the defenders. Calgar was beaten down, his armor shattered. The Inari and the remaining Celestinians fought back-to-back with the Tech Priests. All seemed lost. Then the auto-reliquary opened. Roboute Guilliman did not stumble out. He exploded into motion. The Primarch, the Avenging Sun, the Master of Ultramar, stood once more. He was a giant of blue and gold, wielding the Emperor's sword, the blade of fire his father had used, which had been transported with the Cadian survivors. His face was a mask of cold, imperious fury. He looked upon the traitors not with fear, but with absolute disgust. The fight that followed was a massacre. Guilliman moved with a speed that the post-human Astartes could barely track. He cut through Terminators as if they were made of paper. He smashed sorcerers into paste with his power fist, the Hand of Dominion. The sheer psychological shock of seeing a loyalist Primarch, a myth made flesh, broke the morale of the traitor forces. They had fought the long war believing the Emperor's sons were all dead or ascended to demonhood. To face one in the flesh was a terror they were not prepared for. Guilliman cleared the shrine. He rallied the Ultramarines, his voice booming across the Vox channels with an authority that had not been heard in 10 millennia. He drove the invaders from the Fortress of Hera. But as the adrenaline faded, the tragedy of his awakening set in. Guilliman looked at the Imperium he had woken up to. He saw the cherubs, the skulls, the religious iconography, the Gothic ignorance of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and the xenophobia of the Inquisition. He saw that the secular, rational truth the Emperor had fought for was dead, replaced by a superstitious theocracy that worshipped his father as a god. He fell into a deep despair, locking himself in his scriptorium for days, reading the history of the last 10,000 years. He realized that everything he and his brothers had bled for was ruined. Better that we had all burned in the fires of Horus's ambition than lived to see this, he whispered to the empty air. But Guilliman was a creature of logic and will. He was the lord of logistics, the statesman among soldiers. He realized that despair was a luxury he could not afford. The galaxy was split in half. The enemies of humanity were closing in on all sides. He was the last loyal son, the regent. If the Imperium was to die, he would ensure it died fighting. He emerged from his seclusion with a new purpose. He would secure Ultramar, and then he would travel to Terra. He would stand before the Golden Throne and speak with his father. He would launch a new crusade, the Indomitus Crusade, to reclaim the stars and push back the dark. The Primarch had returned, and with him, a sliver of hope in a galaxy that had known only war. The return of Roboute Guilliman to Terra was not the triumphant parade of a conquering hero, but a desperate race against the encroaching dark. After the harrowing journey of the Terran Crusade, where the Primarch was captured by the Red Corsairs and forced to fight his way through the Maelstrom and the Webway, the Avenging Sun finally stood before the Eternity Gate. The throne world he found was a shadow of the one he had left 10,000 years prior. It was a planet-wide mausoleum of Gothic stone, choking smog and religious hysteria. Yet, his arrival galvanized the dispirited defenders. With the authority of a demigod, he assumed the title of Lord Commander of the Imperium, a position that had lain vacant since the days of Rogel Dorn. He entered the Sanctum Imperialis alone to commune with his father. What passed between the Master of Mankind and his son remains a mystery, but when Guilliman emerged a day later, his face was hardened, and he bore the Emperor's sword, the burning blade of the Master of Mankind, at his hip. He did not speak of the Emperor's condition, but his orders were immediate. The Imperium would not die quietly. The first step in this galactic counter-offensive was the unveiling of a project that had been in motion since the aftermath of the Horus Heresy. For 10 millennia, Archmagos Belisarius Cawl had been laboring in the sealed vaults of Mars, following instructions given to him by Guilliman before the Primarch's near death at the hands of Fulgrim. This was the Ultima founding. As the gates of Cawl's gene labs opened, a new breed of warrior marched forth, the Primaris Astartes. These were not merely replacements for the losses sustained during the opening of the Great Rift, they were an evolution. Cawl had utilized the Sancprimus Portum, a relic containing the pure genetic material of all 20 original Primarchs, to refine the Emperor's work. The Primaris Marines were physically larger and stronger than their firstborn brothers, standing a full head taller, with bone density and muscle mass enhanced to withstand the horrors of the 41st millennium. This physical superiority was achieved through the implantation of 3 new organs, adding to the 19 possessed by standard Space Marines. The first of these new organs was the Magnificat, a small thumbnail-sized lobe inserted into the brain to secrete hormones that intensified the body's growth functions and enhanced the function of the other implants, effectively supercharging the Astartes' biology. The second was the Belisarian Furnace, a dormant organ attached to the hearts. In moments of extreme trauma, it would release a cocktail of combat stimulants and rapid healing enzymes, allowing a Primaris Marine to survive wounds that would kill even a firstborn. The third was the sinew coils, durametallic cables woven into the tendons of the warrior, granting them crushing strength and durability that allowed them to rip open tank hatches with their bare hands. To equip these new warriors, Cawl released the Mark X Tacticus power armor. Unlike the older Marks, which were often scavenged and patched together, the Mark X was a modular system. It could be stripped down to lighter Phobos patterns for stealth operations or up-armored into the heavy Gravis pattern for frontline assaults. They carried the Cawl pattern bolt rifle, a weapon with greater range and armor-piercing capabilities than the venerable Godwin pattern bolter, and wielded plasma incinerators that were far more stable than the volatile weaponry of the past. The integration of the Primaris was not seamless. Guilliman organized them initially into the Unnumbered Sons, vast legions of Greyshields who wore the heraldry of their genetic progenitors but fought in mixed formations. As the Crusade progressed, these warriors were either formed into new chapters or dispersed to reinforce existing ones. This caused significant friction. Many firstborn Marines viewed the Primaris with suspicion, seeing them as tech heresy or an attempt by Mars to usurp the Emperor's design. The Flesh Terrors, led by Gabriel Seth, were particularly vocal, fearing that the Primaris lacked the spiritual flaws, like the Red Thirst, that defined their identity. This tension was only partially alleviated when Marneus Calgar, chapter master of the Ultramarines, voluntarily underwent the Rubicon Primaris, a perilous surgery to upgrade a firstborn into a Primaris. His survival proved that the bridge could be crossed, though the procedure remained lethal for many who attempted it. With his new legions assembled, Guilliman launched the Indomitus Crusade. This was a military undertaking that rivaled the Great Crusade of the 30th millennium in scale. The Crusade fleets left the Sol system in a display of might not seen in an age. Massive battleships of the Imperial Navy, their hulls scarred from the defense of Terra, sailed alongside the sleek strike cruisers of the Astartes and the colossal arc Mechanicus vessels of Mars. But this was not just a conventional army. Guilliman understood that the Great Rift was a spiritual wound. He integrated the Sisters of Silence into the fleets, utilizing their blank souls to banish the demonic incursions that plagued the warp-torn galaxy. He also brought the Adeptus Custodes out of the Imperial Palace. For the first time in 10,000 years, the 10,000 were deployed in significant numbers beyond the Sol system, serving as the emissaries imperatus to ensure the Primarch's will was obeyed. The Crusade was divided into multiple fleets, Fleet Primus, Fleet Secundus, Fleet Tertius, and so on, each tasked with stabilizing a different sector of Imperium Sanctus. Their mission was twofold: to liberate worlds drowning in the tide of chaos, and to deliver the technology of the Primaris to the beleaguered chapters. These torchbearer fleets fought their way through warp storms to reach the homeworlds of the Blood Angels, the Dark Angels, the Space Wolves, and hundreds of others, delivering the gene tech and the reinforcements needed to save the chapters from extinction. Guilliman led Fleet Primus personally. For decades, later standardized by historians as roughly a century, though the warped nature of time near the rift made precise chronology impossible, the Crusade fought a grinding war of reconquest. At the Battle of Rhokkos, the unnumbered suns were finally disbanded, the Grey Shields formally assigned to new chapters, or sent to their parent legions. The Crusade smashed the renegade empires that had sprung up during the Noctis Aeterna, broke the sieges of Cardinal Worlds, and re-established the supply lines that kept the Imperial war machine fed. They fought against the Death Guard in the Plague Wars of Ultramar, where Mortarion sought to drag Guilliman's own realm into Nurgle's garden. They engaged the Necrons of the Sautek dynasty and purged Orquois that had bloated to system-killing sizes. Slowly, painfully, stability returned to the segmentum south of the Great Rift. However, while Guilliman warred amongst the stars, the political rot of Terra threatened to undo his work. The High Lords of Terra, the council that had ruled the Imperium in the Emperor's name for millennia, were not accustomed to answering to a superior. When Guilliman returned, he removed several High Lords whom he deemed incompetent or self-serving, replacing them with reformists loyal to his vision. This sparked the Hexarchy crisis. The deposed High Lords, led by the former master of the Administratum Earthu Hematalion, formed a conspiracy to retake control. They believed Guilliman was a tyrant who violated the Lex Imperialis, and that his reforms were destabilizing the delicate balance of power that had kept the Imperium alive. They utilized the Minotaur's chapter, a space marine force long rumored to be the personal attack dogs of the High Lords, to blockade Terra and threaten the new administration. The Hexarchy incited riots in the Hive cities, weaponizing the fear and religious fervor of the population against the Primarch's appointees. The coup attempt brought the throne world to the brink of civil war. The Minotaurs engaged the Imperial Fists and the Custodes in skirmishes across the Sol system. The crisis was resolved not by open warfare, but by the ruthless pragmatism of the Grand Master of Assassins, Fadix. Though Fadix had seemingly aligned himself with the traitorous Hexarchy, he was, in truth, loyal to the Emperor's regent. In a coordinated strike within the Senatorum Imperialis, Fadix and his assassin temples turned on the conspirators. The treacherous High Lords were slaughtered in their seats, and the Minotaurs were ordered to stand down by the new High Lord of the Administratum, who possessed the codes of authority. The purge of the Hexarchy solidified Guilliman's rule. The static elements of the government were excised, sending a clear message that the time of stagnation was over. While Imperium Sanctus was being forged into a weapon of order, the other half of the galaxy, Imperium Nihilus, was a realm of nightmare. Cut off from the light of the Astronomicon by the Great Rift, millions of worlds were plunged into darkness. Navigation was reduced to short, blind jumps. Astropathic communication was impossible, replaced by the screaming static of the warp. Demons manifested freely, and Xenos' empires expanded unchecked. In this hellscape, survival was the only victory. The anchor of resistance in this dark half of the galaxy was the Baal system, homeworld of the Blood Angels. The devastation of Baal had seen the sons of Sanguinius nearly wiped out by the largest tendril of Hive Fleet Leviathan ever recorded. Tens of thousands of space marines from the Blood Angels and their successor chapters had gathered to defend the grave of their Primarch. They fought until the sands of Baal were turned to red sludge, facing not only the Tyranids, but the manifestation of the greater demon Kabandha, who sought to claim the angels for corn. It was only the opening of the Great Rift, which swallowed the Tyranid fleet, and the subsequent arrival of the Indomitus Crusade that saved the chapter from total annihilation. Guilliman arrived at Baal to find the Blood Angels decimated, their fortress monastery a ruin, and Chapter Master Dante, the oldest living space marine, on the verge of death from exhaustion and wounds. In the aftermath of the battle, amidst the ruins of the Arx Angelicum, a historic meeting took place. Dante, who had led the chapter for over a millennium and yearned for the release of death, knelt before the Primarch expecting censure for the near loss of his sector. Instead, Guilliman raised him up. He looked at the ancient warrior, whose golden mask hid a face lined with 1,500 years of war, and recognized a burden shared. Guilliman could not stay in Imperium Nihilus. The war in the south demanded his attention, and he could not be everywhere at once. He appointed Commander Dante as the regent of Imperium Nihilus. He granted the chapter master authority over all imperial forces north of the Great Rift, every chapter, every regiment, every fleet. It was a title of immense power, but also a terrible curse. Dante was tasked with holding together a crumbling empire in the dark, fighting without the light of the emperor, often without supply lines, against enemies that outnumbered him 1,000 to 1. As the Indomitus fleet departed to return to the light of Sanctus, Dante stood alone, the warden of the dark, rallying the scattered survivors of the Blood Angels to begin the impossible task of reclaiming the night. The era of the Indomitus Crusade changed the face of the galaxy. The static, decaying Imperium of the 41st millennium was gone, replaced by a civilization on a total war footing. The Primaris Astartes brought a new lethality to the battlefield, their repulsor tanks hovering over the wreckage of older wars, their Redemptor dreadnoughts burning heretics with heavy onslaught Gatling cannons. But for every world liberated, another was lost. The Great Rift continued to spew madness. The Necrons were erecting pylons of Blackstone in the Pariah Nexus to silence the souls of humanity. The Tyranids were adapting to the new prey. And in the depths of the warp, the Chaos Gods laughed, for the galaxy was now a game board of fire and blood, and the game was far from over. While the Indomitus Crusade pushed outward to reclaim the stars, stabilizing the sanctified half of the Imperium with the thunder of bolters and the burning promethium of the Primaris legions, a rot was festering in the very heart of Robute Guilliman's home. The realm of Ultramar, the 500 worlds that stood as a beacon of order and logistical perfection, had become the target of a metaphysical assault that defied all rational laws of warfare. This was not a simple invasion of territory. It was a spiritual violation orchestrated by Mortarion, the demon Primarch of the Death Guard, and the grandfatherly malice of the Chaos God Nurgle. The conflict, which would come to be known as the Plague Wars, forced the Avenging Sun to divert the spearhead of his crusade back to the jewel of the galactic East, for the preservation of Ultramar was symbolic of the Imperium's ability to survive at all. The invasion did not begin with orbital bombardments, but with the weeping of reality itself. The Stars of the Scourge, a subsector north of Ultramar, had been swallowed by the warp, transformed into a pestilent domain where the laws of physics were replaced by the logic of disease. From this staging ground, the Death Guard fleets launched their assault. These were not the clean, unified formations of the Great Crusade, but rusted, bloated hulks that leaked virulence into the void. The flagship Endurance, Mortarion's personal fortress vessel, led an armada that looked less like ships and more like floating carcasses of iron and flesh. They bypassed the formidable orbital defenses of Ultramar by utilizing warp rifts that opened like infected wounds in the fabric of space, spilling demonic engines and plague marines directly onto the surface of the agri-worlds and hive cities. The war on the ground was a nightmare of biological attrition. The Death Guard did not fight to conquer, they fought to garden. They sought to turn the pristine worlds of Ultramar into extensions of Nurgle's domain. On the agri-world of Ix, once a hospital planet known for its healing gardens and medical facilities, the soil turned to gray sludge that birthed Nurglings by the thousands. The rivers ran thick with pus, and the air buzzed with the drone of billions of plague flies. The disciplined ranks of the Ultramarines and their successor chapters, the Nova Marines and the Genesis chapter, found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to stay dead. A plague marine could have his arm blown off by a bolt shell and simply laugh, the wound instantly sealing with necrotic jelly as he continued to advance, spreading contagions that rusted ceramite and liquefied lungs. Guilliman prosecuted the war with cold fury, matching his logistical brilliance against the supernatural resilience of his brother. He divided his forces into spearheads, utilizing the speed of the Indomitus fleets to intercept the Death Guard vectors. However, Mortarion was not merely a brute. He was a master of attrition who knew exactly how to dismantle a system based on order. He targeted the supply lines, infecting the grain barges that fed the hive worlds, turning the populace into vectors for the walking pox, a disease that trapped the victim's consciousness inside a rotting, shambling body that turned on its former kin. The psychological toll on the defenders was immense. To fight the Death Guard was to fight despair itself. The climax of the war coalesced on Ajax. Mortarion had turned the planet into a ritual site, intending to drag the entirety of Ultramar into the Garden of Nurgle. Guilliman made planetfall, leading the charge personally. The duel between the two brothers was a clash of eras. Guilliman, clad in the armor of fate and wielding the Emperor's sword, was a shining avatar of the material realm's defiance. Mortarion, a towering, moth-winged reaper shrouded in toxic smog, wielded the scythe Silence and the lantern. They fought amidst the ruins of a medical city, their blows shattering the ferrocrete and sending shockwaves through the warp-saturated air. However, Mortarion had a trap. He possessed a weapon created in the deepest cauldrons of Nurgle's manse, the Godblight. This was a disease capable of killing a Primarch, a pathogen that attacked the soul as voraciously as the body. During the duel, Mortarion managed to infect Guilliman. The effect was immediate. The Avenging Sun, whose physiology could process the deadliest toxins in seconds, fell. The infection turned his blood to black sludge and rotted his armor from the inside out. Guilliman collapsed, his body failing, his soul being dragged into the embrace of the Plague God. Mortarion stood over him, triumphant, ready to offer his brother's soul to Nurgle as the ultimate prize. It was in that moment of absolute defeat that the impossible occurred. As Guilliman lay dying, the boundary between the Materium and the Immaterium tore open, but not with the energy of chaos. The Emperor of Mankind, seated on the Golden Throne light years away on Terra, reached out. The psychic potential of the Master of Mankind channeled through his son's dying form. Guilliman's body ignited with blinding golden fire. The rot was burned away in an instant. The Avenging Sun rose, his eyes glowing with the raw power of the Astronomicon. He did not speak with his own voice, but with the thunderous resonance of his father. The psychic backlash was catastrophic for the forces of Nurgle. The golden fire did not just cleanse the immediate area, it traveled back along the sympathetic bonds of the warp, striking into the Immaterium itself. The Emperor's wrath pierced the mists of the Garden of Nurgle. It scorched the rotting flora, burned down the mansion of the Plague God, and cracked the cauldron of diseases. For the first time in history, a Chaos God felt fear in his own realm. Nurgle, sensing the true danger of the anathema's reach, withdrew his favor. Mortarion was abandoned, the warp energy sustaining his ritual severed. The demon Primarch fled into the warp, dragging his shattered fleet with him. Ultramar was saved, but the implications were terrifying. The Emperor was active, and the war had escalated to a level where gods were taking the field through their proxies. While the Plague Wars raged in the east, the rest of the galaxy was undergoing a transformation no less violent. The opening of the Great Rift had flooded the Milky Way with the energies of the Empyrean. This saturation triggered a species-wide evolutionary leap known as the Psychic Awakening. On a million worlds, ordinary men and women began to manifest powers they could not control. In the hive slums of Necromunda, laborers suddenly found they could read thoughts or start fires with their minds. On the shrine worlds of the Ecclesiarchy, the faithful began to perform miracles that defied physics. This awakening was a double-edged sword of the sharpest kind. For every new psyker who could be tithed to the black ships to feed the Golden Throne or serve the Astra Militarum, 1,000 became living gateways for demonic possession. The black ships were overwhelmed, their holds bursting with screaming witches. On many planets, the awakening led to anarchy. Mobs of terrified citizens lynched anyone showing signs of the witch, while on others, rogue psykers enslaved entire populations, turning planetary governors into puppets. The boundary between reality and nightmare had thinned, and humanity was bleeding psychic energy into a predator-filled ocean. Yet this surge also empowered the faithful. The Sisters of Battle, the Adepta Sororitas, found their acts of faith amplified to devastating levels. On the battlefield, prayers literally turned aside bolter shells. The Emperor's angels were seen manifesting as golden spirits to aid the dying. The psychic awakening proved that humanity was evolving into a psychic race, a metamorphosis the Emperor had foreseen and tried to guide, but which was now happening uncontrollably in the midst of a galactic firestorm. It was a race against time. Would humanity master its new potential, or would it be consumed by the entities waiting on the other side of the veil? While humanity wrestled with its chaotic evolution and the fires of Nurgle, a cold, sterile silence was spreading through the Nephilim sector. The Necrons, the ancient masters of the material universe, had watched the opening of the Great Rift with cold logic. To the Silent King Zarek, the rift was a chaotic abomination, a wound that threatened to consume the galaxy he intended to rule. His solution was not to fight the warp with psychic power, but to sever it completely. This was the Pariah Nexus. The Silent King mobilized the cryptex of the Zarekan dynasty to construct a network of immense pylons made of blackstone, Noctilith. These were not merely defensive structures like the pylons of Cadia, they were dampeners of a magnitude never before seen. Arranged in geometric patterns across star systems, the pylons projected a field known as the Stilling. This field did not just block the warp, it smothered the souls of living beings. As the Nexus expanded, the effects on human populations were horrifying. It was not a violent death, but a slow, spiritual asphyxiation. On worlds engulfed by the Stilling, people simply stopped. They lost the will to eat, to work, to speak. They sat in their homes, staring at walls, their eyes empty, until they died of dehydration or starvation. The field severed the connection between the soul and the warp, cutting off the spark of life and emotion. For Psykers, entering the Nexus was agony, like having their eyes gouged out and their minds encased in lead. For the Sisters of Battle, it was a spiritual hell. They could no longer feel the light of the Emperor. Their prayers went unanswered, echoing in a void of absolute silence. The Imperium's response was Battle Group Khalides, a massive Crusade fleet tasked with breaking the Nexus. The fighting here was unlike anywhere else. The Imperial forces found themselves battling a lethargy that sapped their courage and strength. They fought against Necron legions that were seemingly endless, their reanimation protocols functioning with terrifying efficiency within the Nexus. The Necrons here utilized technology that weaponized the dampening field, unleashing null beams that banished demons instantly and turned space marines into stumbling, confused husks. The Pariah Nexus represented a threat equal to chaos, a piece of the grave, a galaxy of ordered, soulless silence where humanity would be reduced to cattle or eradicated entirely to starve the dark gods. Far to the galactic southwest, another catastrophe was reaching its terminal velocity, born of a gamble made centuries prior. Inquisitor Kryptman, in a desperate bid to stop Hive Fleet Leviathan, had lured a massive tendril of the Tyranids into the Octarius sector, an orc empire of immense power. He had hoped the two xenos species would annihilate each other. For decades, the Octarius War had raged, a meat grinder of biological adaptation versus fungal aggression. The orcs, loving the fight, flocked to the sector from light years away, growing larger and stronger with every battle. The Tyranids, feasting on the endless biomass of the greenskins, evolved at a terrifying rate. The stalemate finally broke. The Swarmlord, the supreme strategic avatar of the hive mind, was deployed to the surface of Octarius. It engaged the overfiend of Octarius, the ruling warlord of the Orc Empire, in a duel that shook the foundations of the Greenskin capital. The Swarmlord, adapting to the brute strength of the Orc, outmaneuvered and butchered the overfiend. With their leader dead, the Orc unity fractured. The Wa dissolved into infighting, and the Tyranids capitalized with ruthless efficiency. The outcome was the worst-case scenario Kryptman's detractors had predicted. The Tyranids did not just win, they consumed the Orcs. They absorbed the biomass of billions of the galaxy's toughest warriors. The Hive fleet that emerged from the ruins of Octarius was not weakened, it was supercharged. This tendril of Leviathan was now larger, stronger, and more adapted to killing hard targets than any before it. The cordon of dead worlds Kryptman had established was overrun. The Tyranids spilled out of the Octarius sector, heading toward the galactic core in Terra. The gamble had failed spectacularly, creating a monster that threatened to eclipse even the horrors of the 13th Black Crusade. As the 42nd millennium progressed, the galaxy was a theater of total war. Guilliman held the center, fighting to keep the flame of civilization alive. In the north, Dante fought in the dark against monsters. In the Nephilim sector, the Necrons built their silent cages. And from the dark void, the shadow of the Great Devourer lengthened, eager to consume what little remained of a galaxy set aflame. The Indomitus Crusade had bought humanity time, but the price was paid in blood, and the bill was coming due. While the Indomitus Crusade carved a bloody path of reconquest through the stars, and the Plague Wars tested the spiritual resolve of Ultramar, a new and insidious configuration of power was coalescing within the warp. The Great Rift had not merely split the galaxy, it had stirred the ambitions of entities that dwelt in the liminal spaces between the realms of the Chaos Gods. Among these was Vashtor the Archiphane, a demigod of the Soul Forge, a being not of pure martial conquest but of industry, contracts, and malevolent innovation. Vashtor sought to ascend to the pantheon of the Dark Gods, to become a fifth major power, and to achieve this, he required something that could not be forged in the Empyrean alone. He needed a weapon of the Old Ones, locked away in a vault so secret that even the memory of its location had been erased from history. To pick this lock, Vashtor approached Abaddon the Despoiler with a proposition that would reshape the strategy of the Long War. The alliance forged between the Warmaster and the Archiphane birthed the Arks of Omen. These were not standard warships, but colossal space hulks, drifting aggregations of lost ships, asteroids, and debris, dragged from the warp, and infected with a techno-organic virus of Vashtor's design. The Archiphane's dark genius fused the metal and stone of these hulks into coherent, weaponized forms. They were fitted with engines of impossible size and navigation systems guided by bound demons. Abaddon, seeing an opportunity to shatter the stalemate of the Indomitus era, agreed to the pact. He provided the fleets and the warriors. Vashtor provided the arcs and the means to navigate the Great Rift with impunity. The purpose of these arcs was the collection of key fragments. These artifacts were scattered across the galaxy, often hidden in the vaults of ancient Eldari craftworlds, Imperial reliquaries, or buried on dead worlds. The Bale fleet's massive armadas led by the Arks launched simultaneous strikes across the Imperium. This was a war of extraction, not occupation. The Arks would smash into a system, unleash torrents of boarding torpedoes and drop pods filled with traitor Astartes and demonic engines, seize the specific artifact required, and vanish back into the warp before a significant counter-offensive could be mustered. The Imperium, still reeling from the opening of the Rift and the wars in Ultramar, found itself fighting a Hydra-headed enemy that struck without apparent logic, unaware that every stolen fragment was bringing a doomsday clock closer to midnight. One of the most brazen assaults of this campaign targeted the Rock, the mobile fortress monastery of the Dark Angels. Vashtor believed that a key fragment, or the intelligence required to locate one, was hidden within the deepest dungeons of the ancient remnant of Caliban. The assault on the Rock was a violation that enraged the Unforgiven. The Archiphane's forces breached the Void shields and boarded the fortress, their demonic code viruses attempting to subvert the Rock's cogitators. It was during this desperate defense that the Dark Angels' secretive history began to unravel, but the true revelation was taking place light years away, in a region of space shrouded by the psychic mists of Imperium Nihilus. Deep within the Somnium stars, and resonating with the psychic frequency of the Dark Angels' heritage, a legend was waking from a 10,000-year slumber. Lion L. Johnson, the Primarch of the First Legion, had not died on Caliban as history believed. He had been sleeping in the heart of the Rock, but his consciousness had been adrift in a mirror realm of the warp known as the Forest. As the galaxy screamed in agony, the Lion finally opened his eyes. He did not emerge on the Rock, however, but on the ruined world of Camarth within the Imperium Nihilus. The Lion who returned was not the golden-haired, pristine knight of the Great Crusade. Time had touched him, even in stasis. His hair had turned the gray of winter iron, and his face was lined with the weight of millennia. He was an elder king, a warrior who had aged into a terrifying majesty. He found himself in a galaxy that was a grotesque parody of the one he had left, a realm where his father was worshipped as a god and humanity was besieged on all sides. Yet the lion did not succumb to the despair that had briefly gripped Guilliman. He was a hunter, and this was a target-rich environment. L. Johnson discovered he possessed a new ability, a supernatural connection to the forest that allowed him to forest walk. He could step into the shadows of one location and emerge from the shadows of another, traversing planetary distances or even crossing between systems without the need for a ship. On Camarth, he began a one-man war against the Chaos Warbands, enslaving the population. It was here that he encountered the Fallen. These were the Dark Angels who had sided with Luther and been scattered through time and space. But the Lion, aged and wiser, did not execute them on sight. He sensed no chaotic taint in many of them, only regret and madness born of being hunted for 10,000 years. In an act of radical forgiveness that fundamentally changed the First Legion, the Lion accepted the loyalty of the non-corrupted Fallen, rebranding them as the Risen. With this personal guard of veteran Astartes, the Lion began to liberate the blood-soaked sectors of Imperium Nihilus, his legend spreading like wildfire before him. The machinations of Vashtor and the return of the Lion were destined to collide. The Archiphane had gathered nearly all the key fragments, but the final component required to synthesize the key was a massive discharge of specific psychic energy, a dissonance that could tear reality in a precise manner. Vashtor set his sights on the Malakbale system. Here, the Imperium had constructed the Coral Engine, an immense psychic beacon and astropathic relay intended to pierce the darkness of Imperium Nihilus and re-establish contact with Terra. It was a beacon of hope, and thus a perfect fuel source for Vashtor's design. The Battle of Wormwood, as the conflict in the Malakbale system came to be known, was a convergence of galactic powers. The Indomitus Fleet Quarter, tasked with defending the engine, was besieged by the World Eaters. Angron, the demon Primarch of Khorne, had returned from the warp once again. Since the opening of the Great Rift, the Red Angel could be summoned with terrifying ease, his banishments lasting only weeks or months before the Blood Gods spat him back out. Angron descended upon Malakbale not as a general, but as a force of nature, a towering avalanche of red muscle, brass armor, and pure, unadulterated rage. He smashed through the Imperial defenses, caring nothing for tactics, driven only by the Butcher's nails and the need to silence the Coral Engine's psychic song, which burned his demonic essence. As the Imperial lines collapsed under the weight of the World Eaters and Vashtor's cultists, the Lion arrived. He forest-walked directly onto the surface of the planet, interposing himself between the slaughter and the surviving defenders. The meeting of the two brothers was a study in contrasts, the frenzied, monstrous berserker against the aged, disciplined knight. The Lion wielded fealty, a power sword of immense craftsmanship, and carried the Emperor's shield, a relic he had retrieved from his fortress, which radiated a golden aura of protection. The duel was cataclysmic. Angron fought with a speed and strength that defied physics, his blows shattering the ground and sending shockwaves through the air. The Lion, older and slower than he had been in his youth, could not match Angron's brute force. Instead, he fought with cold calculation. He used the Emperor's shield to catch Angron's chain axe, the golden light of the shield burning the demon's flesh upon contact. He led the Red Angel into traps, using the debris of the battlefield to hinder the monster's movements. While the Primarchs dueled, Angron succeeded in his primary, instinctual goal. He reached the Coral Engine. With a roar that drowned out the orbital bombardment, Angron smashed the spinal column of the psychic machine. The destruction of the Coral Engine released a psychic backlash of apocalyptic proportions. This was the murder curse. The wave of energy rolled across the system, stripping the sanity from millions of loyalist soldiers, turning them instantly into frothing, blood-crazed killers who turned their weapons on their own comrades. The entire fleet in orbit descended into a cannibalistic frenzy. In the midst of this psychic storm, the Lion saw his opening. As Angron reveled in the destruction, the Lion struck. He did not try to overpower the demon, he outmaneuvered him. Channeling his focus, the Lion drove fealty through Angron's throat, while simultaneously bashing him with the Emperor's shield. The holy energies of the shield combined with the lethal wound banished Angron's physical form. The demon Primarch dissolved into a cloud of burning blood and ash, cast back into the warp screaming in frustration. However, the victory was hollow. The destruction of the coral engine was exactly what Vashtor had engineered. The psychic death scream of the beacon, combined with the bloodshed of the murder curse, created the Great Dissonance. Vashtor, hovering above the battlefield in his arc, captured this energy. The key was forged. With a gesture, the Archifane tore a hole in reality, not into the warp, but into the webway, creating a tunnel toward the Somnium stars where his prize awaited. The lion, standing amidst the ruins of the coral engine and the corpses of the driven mad defenders, could only watch as Vashtor escaped. The first Primarch had returned and defeated one brother, but another enemy had outplayed them all. The lion gathered the survivors, including Dante of the Blood Angels who had come to aid the defense, and prepared for the next phase of the war. He formally took command of the Protectorate of Imperium Nihilus, allowing Dante a moment of respite, though the galaxy they sought to save was crumbling faster than they could rebuild it. While the eyes of the Imperium were fixed on the Arcs of Omen and the return of the traitor Primarchs, a threat of even greater magnitude was manifesting on the opposite side of the galaxy. The High Lords in the Indomitus Crusade had believed that Hive Fleet Leviathan was effectively broken or distracted by the Octarius War and the defense of Baal. They were catastrophically wrong. The Tyranid assaults on the eastern fringe had merely been the tendrils of a creature testing its prey. The main body of the Hive Fleet had not attacked, it had moved. Navigating through the intergalactic void beneath the galactic plane, the bulk of Hive Fleet Leviathan had bypassed the Imperial defensive lines entirely. It resurfaced in the Segmentum Pacificus, the galactic west. This was the onset of the Fourth Tyrannic War. The scale of this invasion dwarfed everything that had come before. The Tyranids attacked on a front thousands of light years wide. This was not a spear thrust, it was a pair of jaws closing around the galaxy. One jaw, the tendril known as Nautilin, pushed from the galactic southwest, while the other, Promether, swept down from the northwest. Their trajectory was clear to the strategos of Terra. They were encircling the Segmentum Solar. They were heading for the throne world, not directly, but by consuming everything around it first to cut off reinforcements. The shadow in the warp generated by this biomass was so dense that it began to blot out the Astronomicon in the western reaches of the galaxy, creating a second Dark Imperium within the sanctified territory. Entire sectors went silent overnight. The Tyranids of the Fourth War displayed terrifying new adaptations. The Norn emissaries, massive synapse creatures bred for specific assassination and objective seizing missions, began to appear, hunting down planetary governors and chapter masters within their own fortresses. The Neuroterrans acted as mobile psychic nodes, coordinating the swarms with a malevolent intellect that countered Imperial tactics in real time. The Imperial response was the deployment of the Sawblade fleets. Under the overall strategic command of Lord Commander Solar Leontis, the supreme commander of the Astra Militarum, the Imperium mobilized its reserves. These fleets were elite strike forces designed to hit the Tyranid tendrils at critical juncture points, not to stop the swarm, which was impossible given the numbers, but to disrupt its synapse network and slow its advance. The Adeptus Custodes, recognizing the existential threat to the Emperor, marched forth in numbers not seen since the war in the Webway, their golden ships leading the counter-charges. This war was different from the wars against Chaos. Chaos wanted to corrupt and conquer. The Tyranids simply wanted to eat. There was no negotiation, no moral victory, only the binary outcome of survival or consumption. The Sawblade fleets fought desperate battles in the Sanctum and Bastir subsectors, utilizing hit and run tactics to fracture the hive mind's control. But for every victory, a dozen worlds were stripped bare. The Tyranids were adapting to the Primaris gene seed, creating bioforms specifically designed to crack the new armor and consume the enhanced biomass of Guilliman's sons. As the 41st millennium bled into the uncharted era of the 42nd, the galaxy stood on the precipice of total annihilation. The timeline of the Imperium, once a rigid record of years, had shattered into a disjointed narrative of survival. To the east, the plague stars festered. To the north, the pariah nexus silenced the souls of billions. In the center, the Great Rift bled madness into reality, and Vashtor the Archifane burrowed toward a weapon that could end the war in a single stroke. To the west, the jaws of the Great Devourer were closing, threatening to consume the cradle of humanity. Yet, amidst the encroaching dark, the fires of resistance burned brighter than they had in 10,000 years. The Emperor stirred on his throne, his psychic might manifesting miracles across the cosmos. Two loyal sons, Robute Gilliman and Lion Eljonson, walked the stars once more, rallying the scattered defenders of mankind. The technology of the Primaris and the return of the Squats, now the Leagues of Votan, offered new tools for the war effort. The Necrons, fighting for their own dominion, formed an unwitting bulwark against the warp. The Eldari, united under the Inari death cult, sought to birth a god to slay Slaanesh. The story of the 41st millennium is not a story of victory. It is a story of raging against the dying of the light. It is a universe where there is only war, where the laughter of thirsting gods echoes in the void, and where the only certainty is that humanity will not go quietly into the night. The clock stands at 1 minute to midnight, and the hands are frozen, caught between the ticking of the mechanism and the hammer blow that seeks to shatter the glass. The war continues, eternal and absolute, for in the grim darkness of the far future, there is no peace, only the desperate, glorious, and unending struggle for survival.